Hello, and welcome to the LIVECAST podcast, the one true chapter by chapter podcast going through A Song of Ice and Fire, one chapter a week. I'm one of your hosts, Jeff, better known as Brenda B. Fish.
And I'm your other host, Emmett, better known as Poor Quentin.
And welcome to the 89th episode of the LIVECAST titled Hat Trick, an analysis of A Clash of Kings Tyrion IV, in which Tyrion's just going to need you to sign this NDA. Boilerplate, really nothing to it. He swears. Would Tyrion lie to you?
I threw a sports reference in there for you, Jeff. I thought that was like an olive branch, like a bone to
It's
a dog.
Catnip, man. It was like catnip for me.
An even better comparison. But yeah, all these early Tyrion chapters obviously are glorious, but we were looking forward to this one. Maybe everyone doesn't enjoy the early Bran chapters in the Clash of Kings as much as we do, or the Team Dragonstone stuff, but I think we can all agree that Tyrion IV is a masterpiece. Am I right?
Tyrion IV is a total masterpiece. I mean, obviously, if you look at my name here on the LIVECAST brand, greater than signed Tyrion. So all the people who are saying
letting your freak flag fly as always, sir.
As I always do here on the internet, on the online, on the youtube.com. Yes. So Tyrion IV is a great chapter. Of course, I prefer Bran 2 to Tyrion IV. Nothing wrong with Tyrion IV, but this chapter is absolutely great, but it's only overshadowed slightly by Bran 2, which is just awesome. So
acceptable opinion.
I appreciate that. So, as always, this episode is brought to you by our small council, our Hand of the King Wolfman Zach, Grand Maester Tim Bob, Lord Commander of the King's Guard Mark N, Lord Travis, Master of Ships and Ward of the Waves, Sir Keith J, Master of Whisperers, Lord Philip the Merciful, Master of Laws, Jancy O, Lady Commander of the Night's Watch, Lord Jean, Master of Coin, Archmaester June, Healer of the Lesser Poxes, Ragged Michael, Ward of the North, Nelson the Hammer, Prince of Dragonscone, Scarlet the Other Red Woman and Mistress of Whisperers, Lord Micah, Warden of the West and the Kraken's Bane, Lord James, the Gem that was promised, the High Bearded Priest, the Blue-Ringed Octoling, Lord Jake Assistant to the Hand of the King, Lady Zena Valyrium, Hedrigal, Captain of the Airship Arrogance, His Grace's High Inquisitor, Sir Frank B., High Frank of the Chat, Sir Jasper the Cruel, the King's Justice, Lawrence, Prince of Dorne, Richard, Sea Lord of Bravos, Kelly, Warden of the East, Mistress of Old Bay of Crabs, Stephen the Steadfast, Master of Hounds, the Blue Winter Rose, Knight of Highgarden, Lady Stephanie, Lord Ryan, Lord Anonymous, Lord Carlos, Lord Andrew the Restless, a Priest of the Drowned God, the King's Cook, Noli, Oli, Master of Cannoli, and our newest member of the Small Council, Sir Sorcidelica, who has been promoted from being a High Lord to a member of the Small Council. Thank you, Councilors, very much, and welcome to the Small Council, Sir Sorcidelica.
Welcome indeed to Sir Sorcidelica, and thank you very much, Councilors, as always. And well done, Jeff, with your pronunciations.
I'm putting things now phonetically here in the document. You guys can't see the document that I'm reading as I'm doing this, so I have to do it phonetically for some of these because I can't read. I don't read because I can't read, sort of thing. So
it's like a heartwarming. It's like an Oscar bait movie. I can just see the trailer already. It's beautiful.
That's beautiful. I like that. So our spoiler warning, as we say in all episodes, we'll potentially be talking about all published books. That's the 5 novels, 3 Duck-Egg novellas, histories, interviews, the Windsor sample chapters, as well as Game of Thrones, the TV show. Anything and everything.
Lord James, the Jim who was promised, a small council patron, asks, what has watching the show and reading the books demonstrated to you about the relative power of the different media? And in B-Fish's case, listening to the books. For me, the visuals dominate despite multiple rereads. I'm curious on your take. Let's throw out Lord of the Rings and the Fever Dream graphic novel while we are at it. It's a terrific question and definitely something I think about a lot, especially in the wake of the show finishing. It's a question we're going to return to in terms of this chapter's contents itself near the end of the episode. But what do you think about that just in general, Jeff? What is that balance between show and books? What do you think about that these days?
It's really hard for me to separate the two because when I'm reading Tyrion, I'm not seeing possibly the Tyrion that's on page. I'm seeing Peter Dinklage. When I'm reading Cersei Lannister in this chapter, I'm seeing Lena Headey. When I'm reading Bronn, I'm not seeing the Bronn character in there. I'm seeing Jerome Flynn. And that's not bad, I don't think. I mean, I again, as most of you guys probably know at this point, I came to the books through the show. So I finished seasons 1 and seasons 2 before I started actually reading the books. And I think that was a good kind of gateway for me into this kind of fantasy series. And the Song of Ice and Fire has been a gateway for me into like other fantasy series as well. So I know I'm kind of a little bit kind of basic as the kids are saying these days, and that's okay to be basic. But I tend to view I tend to have a hard time seeing sometimes the way that George is putting different characters in as opposed to seeing what the show is. Now, for those characters that are not in the books, I have a much stronger sense of who they are and what they look like. And sometimes in my head, I don't know if you do this, man, but sometimes in my head, like for a character like John Connington, I'll like think of Kevin McKidd from Rome, the TV show Rome, HBO's Rome, as the stand-in in my head. For other characters, I have different ideas as well about different people who might play the part. So I've kind of had these fan casting ideas in my mind for characters that are in the books, major characters in the books that are not necessarily in the show. But I think it's fun. But so I guess I have a harder time. What about you, man? What do you think?
It really varies. Certain characters, I think, have just been mentally colonized for me by their show version selves. Like Varys. Varys is Conleth Hill, and there's just nothing I can do about that. That's just permanently a state of affairs in my brain. And other characters are like in between. Like Alfie Allen keeps shifting in and out of my mental picture of Theon because he does not remotely resemble Theon in the books, but he's also a really good actor who did a great job portraying Theon, so he's kind of emotionally there for me. And then you get like other sequences, like, you know, the House of the Undying is an extremely visual sequence in terms of how it's written, but wasn't really translated one-to-one to the show. So where does that fit in? It varies all over the place. I just got the Clash of Kings illustrated edition.
Oh, nice.
Which has some wonderful, beautiful art in it. And so that's already having an impact on how I think about those chapters as we're going through this book. It's constantly evolving. And I think I'm interested that there are certain parts of the books that are obviously more cinematically designed than others, but those don't necessarily end up being the ones translated to the show. As I said, like House of the Undying, no, but the Blackwater, yes, very much so. Like when I read Davos's third chapter in the Clash of Kings now, the Wildfire chapter, I think about Liam Cunningham on the deck of his boat getting blown apart into that, you know, fire green, and then Tyrion reacting and Stannis reacting. That's what I think about. So it's a mixed bag, and I think it's going to continue changing as we go through the books. And again, you get an illustrated edition, you get different fan art here. That's something I'm glad is never static, is I think the visual relationship to the books.
Yeah, I agree there. The question was also asked by Lord James Jibbo's promise about Lord of the Rings and the Fever Dream the Fever Dream novel. For me, I mostly see Fever Dream in the same way that I've read the novel now, the graphic novel, but I do mostly see it in my own head just because I've actually read the books before I actually read the graphic novel. And then for Lord of the Rings, I absolutely see all the characters as, you know, all the actors that we saw in the 2001, 2002, 2003 films. Sorry, J.R.R. Tolkien. That's just how it is.
Yeah, those are interesting questions for me of style because, yeah, a lot of the actors in Lord of the Rings I picture now when I read the books, like Sean Bean as Boromir, for example, all the Hobbits definitely. But there's this, like, you know, the sweeping horn-led grandeur of Jackson's take, well, which I love on its own merits. Lord of the Rings still feels very kind of small and handmade, even on an epic scale to me, just in terms of how the prose works and how it's described. And there were certain moments that are cinematic, like I'll never forget the lightning clap that reveals the white hand of Saruman on the army of Uruk-hai as it marches on home in the Book of the Two Towers. And I feel like Jackson took that moment and made it like the aesthetic cornerstone for the entire battle sequence, which is a great adaptational decision, but the rest of the battle doesn't really look like that. And that's, for me, that kind of tone is still sort of the appeal for Lord of the Rings. So not a lot of the visuals have translated for me. Fever Dream visually just, it feels very, like New Orleans-y and very kind of noirish to me, or something like Boardwalk Empire. Like that's the kind of vibe I tend to get off of it visually. And the graphic novel for me just kind of underlined that. It didn't really contradict it.
Absolutely.
So thank you to Lord James, the Jim who was promised, for the question. And if you'd like to ask us questions that we'll answer here on the NotaCast podcast, you're welcome to subscribe as a Sworn Sword or higher level patron at patreon.com/NotaCast, ASOIAF.
And speaking of our Patreon, our next Patreon-only episode, our full-out analysis of the Greyjoy Rebellion with thematic analysis of Ironborn culture, the short, stupid history of history's greatest dumb Lord Reaper of Pike, Balon Greyjoy, lots and lots of Emmett's Euron analysis, and me getting into my war shit feels about all the battles from the Greyjoy Rebellion is coming everyone's way on Thanksgiving week. So if you're watching the live cast starting a week from today, if you guys are listening to this episode starting the day of the actual general release date. And just to give you guys a little bit of a better idea of our release schedule, it'll be out for our small counselors on Monday, November 25th, High Lords and Ladies and Kingsguard on Tuesday, November 26th, Sworn Swords on Wednesday, November 27th, and Poor Fellows on the greatest American holiday, Thanksgiving Day, Thursday, November 28th. But enough about Patreon. On to Tyrion IV. And when we last checked in with the protagonist of Clash of Kings, Tyrion Lannister had just started a great chain and chilled with Varys in Tywin Lannister's tunnel. Let's see what type of awesome shit Tyrion Lannister gets into in this synopsis of A Clash of Kings, Tyrion IV. Grand Maester Pycelle apologized to Tyrion for the early morning meeting, but you see, he's an old idiot, and he'd rather be up and about than lying in bed feeling anxious about who he'll betray next. Breakfast is brought, and Pycelle states that it's plain because of all the starvation going on in the city. Tyrion thinks this is commendable as he takes a bite of egg, but Tyrion's view is a more Epicurean one. If there is food, I eat it, in case there's not on the morrow. Tyrion then asks if the ravens get up early, and Pycelle says that they do, but why ask? Does Tyrion want Pycelle to write a message to send somewhere maybe? Tyrion says, nah, he's already got it covered, but they need to talk in private all the same. So Pycelle dismisses his servant, and Tyrion informs Pycelle that he has 2 copies of an urgent letter for Prince Doran Martell, and he'll need Pycelle's fastest birds to fly to Dorne to deliver the message. Tyrion hands Pycelle the paper and asks him to hustle his ass up and go send the bird to Dorne. The Grand Maester shuffles off slowly with the messages, and Tyrion notices that the Grand Maester's chain doesn't have many of the common metals. Instead, it's all blinged out with gemstones, silver, gold, and platinum. Pycelle ends up walking so slow that Tyrion is able to finish his entire breakfast with all of the free time. Tyrion then can take a little old peek at the maze of shelves that Pycelle has his maester chambers with all that, again, free time. He sees hundreds of vials, milk glass bottles, jars, all well labeled. He spies a couple of medicines/poisons, and he grabs one little bottle off the shelf, smiles, and slips it in his sleeve. When Pycelle returns from totally delivering the messages, the Grand Maester tries to pry out what was in the messages, but Tyrion's not about to tell Grand Maester Pycelle anything. Well, will maybe Tyrion tell the Small Council? No, he's not going to do that either. The Small Council merely advises the king. Also, no, Tyrion won't be telling Cersei too. She's just so burdened by having to rule and do all that kind of queen regency shit. Ah, the old man muttered to his plums. Doubtless you have the right of it, my lord. It is most considerate of you to spare her this burden. Well, that's just the sort of fellow I am. Considerate. Pycelle drones on about how Cersei is frail because she's a lady, and Tyrion's like, yeah, sure, my dude. So frail. But Tyrion must be going, you see, and if you get any message back from Doran Martell, be sure not to inform anyone but Tyrion, okay, Pycelle? Remember, Pycelle, don't tell anyone but me. The Grand Maester says, of course, he will only tell Tyrion. One, Tyrion thought. Tyrion walks out to the lower bailey of the Red Keep and meets up with a Bronn who's observing some knights and men-at-arms training with blunted weapons. But when Bronn doesn't even notice some of the hot serving girls passing by, Tyrion teases Bronn about being too intent on fighting, which leads Bronn to say he'll go purchase a sex worker for a copper if he wants to. Bit of a paraphrase there. But one day my life may hang on how close I've watched your louts. You see, Bronn's still training people to fight on Tyrion's behalf, and he's most impressed by this kid named Sir Talad, a hedge knight. The problem is that Talad fights with a rhythm, and that's going to end up getting the knight killed one day down the road, especially if Talad ends up fighting Bronn. They head off across the bailey with Bronn looking #dank, as the kids say, and Tyrion feeling small and weird, as he kind of often does. Tyrion asks how many people have come to bake his audience, and Bronn says, 30, dude. Enjoy that. And to keep us on a brisker pace for the synopsis, let's bullet point who everyone is and what they want from Tyrion. Lady Tana Stokeworth wants to have dinner with Tyrion in order to persuade Tyrion to wed her, quote, slow-witted daughter Lolly's lovely. Tyrion declines. 2, a moneylender from Bravos wants to get repayment on a loan. Tyrion sends him on to Littlefinger. 3, a river lords come down to swear his allegiance to Joffrey and ask for more peasants after Lannister war criminals killed all of his. Tyrion will see him tomorrow. 4, bakers, butchers, and greengrocers demand that Tyrion provide the protection after a baker was killed by a mob, which included gold cloaks. Awesome. Tyrion sends them away with his regrets. 5, and finally, Sir Alliser Thorne has arrived in King's Landing bearing a rotten hand in a jar. Tyrion, who doesn't like that piece of motherfucking shit, Sir Alliser says to put him up in the worst room of the Red Keep, and he won't see him anytime soon. In the outer yard, Tyrion encounters Cersei, who seems none too pleased to see her brother. Still, Tyrion thinks Cersei looks hot this morning, which, yeah, man, those Lannisters are so fucked up like a football bat when it comes to their sibling relationships. She's there with 2 Kingsguard knights, as well as Giles Rosby, Hallie the Pyromancer, and Lancel Lannister, her cousin and new favorite who've been recently promoted to knighthood. Tyrion asks where everyone's off to, and Cersei says that she's going to inspect the scorpions and spitfires on the walls because she's very keen on seeing the city defended, unlike Tyrion. She states that Renly's on the march from Highgarden, moving up from the King's Road, and Tyrion's like, yeah, Varys told me that too. Still, Tyrion's not all that concerned about Renly. Sure, he's got a massive army, but he could end up meeting Tywin or Robb Stark in battle, and he's not going to be arriving anytime soon. Were I he, Tyrion says, I would do much as he is doing. Make my progress, flaunt my power for the realm to see, watch, wait. Let my rivals contend while I bide my own sweet time. If Stark defeats us, well, the South will fall into Renly's hand like a windfall from the gods, and he'll not have lost a man. And if it goes the other way, he can descend on us while we're weakened. Cersei ain't happy about this, and she has a point about that. She demands that Tywin come back from Harrenhal. But Tyrion knows that's fucking stupid. Besides, Tywin wouldn't listen to Tywin or Cersei. But Cersei wants to know how and when Tyrion is going to free Jaime since he's worth 100 Tyrions, which leads to Tyrion deflecting that question for a future subplot in Clash of Kings. This then leads to Cersei thankfully riding away with her entourage chasing after her. With Cersei gone, Tyrion thinks about Renly, and strangely, Tyrion thinks Renly isn't the greatest threat. He's young and green, having never seen battle. The greater concern is Stannis! I'm sorry, I always do that. Hell yeah. But Tyrion has no idea what Stannis is doing on Dragonstone. None of the spies that Tyrion had sent to Dragonstone returned, and Varys' little birds in Stannis' court had grown strangely silent too. But there had been sightings of Lycian war galleys off the coast, and there was word of cell sails gathering with Stannis on Dragonstone. If Stannis attacks by sea while his brother Renly storms the gates, they'll soon be mounting Joffrey's head on a spike. Worse, mine will be beside him. Tyrion thinks this is a distressing thought, and he'll work to get Shay out of the city if it comes to that. But back at the Solar, Tyrion runs into Podrick Payne, who stares at the ground when talking with Tyrion, telling the Hand of the King that Littlefinger is in his chambers. After teasing the boy a bit, Tyrion walks in and finds Lord Peter, Sansa's gonna get you, you motherfucking sucker, Baelish sitting at the window seat watching Joffrey attempt to do some small animal murder for sport, because of course, Littlefinger states that Joffrey is terrible at doing murder on small animals and invites Tyrion to watch with him. And the two observe Joffrey missing hares over and over again with crossbow bolts. Littlefinger tells Podrick that he should invest in pots, as the castle will soon be overgrown with rabbits in the coming months due to all the ones that are evading Joffrey's crossbow bolts. Tyrion asks if Podrick can get Littlefinger some refreshment, but Littlefinger says no. Drink with a dwarf, it said, and you'll wake up walking on the wall. Have no fear, my lord, Tyrion thought. It's not the wall I have in mind for you. Tyrion compliments to Littlefinger looking elegant today, but the Master of Coin fakes having his feelings hurt, saying that he should look elegant every day. And then Tyrion makes a rapid shift in the conversation. Well, that's a handsome knife as well. Is it? There was mischief in Littlefinger's eyes. He drew the knife and glanced at it casually if he had never seen it before. Valyrian steel and a dragonbone hilt. A trifle plain, though. It's yours if you would like it. Mine? Tyrion gave him a long look. No, I think not. Never mind. He knows the insolent wretch. He knows that I know, and he thinks that I cannot touch him. The problem is that it's not just that Littlefinger thinks Tyrion can't touch him. Tyrion himself thinks that, as he explains in Littlefinger's post-Sully backstory. If ever a man was truly armored in gold, it was Peter Baelish, not Jaime Lannister. Jaime's famous armor was but gilded steel, but Littlefinger, Tyrion had learned quite a few things about Sweet Peter and to his growing disquiet. 10 years ago, Jon Arryn had given him a minor sinecure in customs, where Lord Peter had soon distinguished himself by bringing in 3 times as much as any of the king's other collectors. King Robert had been a prodigious spender. A man like Peter Baelish, who had a gift for rubbing 2 dragons together to breed a third, was invaluable to his hand. Littlefinger's rise had been arrow swift. Within 3 years of his coming to the court, he was master of coin and a member of the small council. And today, the crown's revenues were 10 times what they had been under his beleaguered predecessor, though the crown's debts had grown vast as well. A master juggler was Peter Baelish. So wait, if they're bringing in so much cash, why is the realm in such obscene debt? This fiscal conservative wants to know. And Tyrion's investigations of the present show Littlefinger working to enhance the crown's finances, cleverly investing the crown's gold in textiles, grain, ships, etc. And he put his own men into government jobs. The keeper of the keys were all his, all 4. The king's counter and the king's scales were men he'd named. The officers in charge of all 3 mints, harbor masters, tax farmers, customs sergeants, wool factors, toll collectors, pursers, wine factors, 9 of every 10 belonged to Littlefinger. They were men of middling birth, by and large, merchant sons, lesser lordlings, sometimes even foreigners, but judging from the results, far more able than their highborn predecessors. Still, Littlefinger seems so harmless. He had no major lords for patrons, no armies, no holdings, no prospects for a great marriage. And Tyrion thinks he can't touch him, even if he is a traitor. Like, Tyrion, come on, man, you absolutely can touch him. Regardless, Tyrion thinks he'll maybe take the moderate move and remove some of Littlefinger's dudes and replace them with his own men. But Tyrion's thoughts are interrupted by Littlefinger commenting that Joffrey finally killed one of the hares. Tyrion takes that opportunity to get to business. He asks how close Littlefinger is to the daughters of House Tully, and Littlefinger's all like, super fucking close. Emphasis on the fucking. He totally super banged both Tully sisters like the hot dick that he is. Tyrion thinks that Littlefinger is lying about banging Catelyn, but maybe Catelyn was lying? No, Tyrion, wrong. Catelyn is pure. She would never, ever lie. All the same, Tyrion knows that Catelyn and Lysa don't love him, so he wants Littlefinger, who was so close to the Tully sisters, to pass on a proposal on his behalf. He tells Littlefinger that he wants Lysa to be brought back into the king's peace. In exchange for that, he'll tell Lysa who Jon Arryn's true killer is. Littlefinger, suddenly feeling his pits going extremely, extremely moist, gets all fidgety. Oh, well, who could that possibly be? Who is Jon Arryn's true killer? But Tyrion's not going to tell Littlefinger that. He needs Lysa's friendship and her swords first. Littlefinger reports that Lysa's got worries of her own. All those mountain clans, they're raiding in force and with good weapons. Distressing, Tyrion said, who had armed them. But maybe Tyrion could help in exchange for Lysa swearing to Joffrey. And Littlefinger cuts in and is like, yeah, I know what you're about to say, and there's no fucking way Lysa is going to march against Riverrun. But that's not what Tyrion means. He'd rather have Lysa helping out against Stannis and Renly, and then she'll get Jon Arryn's killer and relief from the mountain clansmen. Hell, Tyrion will even throw in having Sweet Robin named Warden of the East. Okay, fine. He'll also marry Sweet Robin to Myrcella too. There. What a bargain. Littlefinger's surprised by this. Does Cersei know? Does the queen know? Tyrion shrugs, grinning, and Littlefinger laughs and says that Tyrion is a dangerous dude. Maybe he'll do this for Tyrion, but what's his reward? Harrenhal. It was interesting to watch Littlefinger's face. Lord Peter's father had been the smallest of small lords. His grandfather a landless hedge knight. Harrenhal was one of the richest plums in the Seven Kingdoms, its lands broad and rich and fertile. Its great castle was formidable as any in the realm, and so large as the dwarf River Run, where Peter Baelish had been fostered by Hoster Tully, only to be brusquely expelled when he dared raise his sights to Lord Hoster's daughter. Littlefinger pretends to be bored, saying that Harrenhal is cursed, but Tyrion's like, well, just, fucking destroy it and repair it. You'll have the cash for that, and you also have the fealty of the River Lords, after all, even the Tullys. Littlefinger looked like a boy who had taken a furtive bite from a honeycomb. He was trying to watch for bees, but the honey was so sweet. Littlefinger tries to express skepticism, asking why Tyrion would make Littlefinger the greatest lord of Westeros. Well, because Littlefinger served so well in the, quote, matter of succession. But Janos Slynt also, quote, served well too. Yeah, but Tyrion didn't need Janos Slynt. He needs Lysa. And he'd rather Peter have Harrenhal than Renly have the Iron Throne. Baelish says he'll have to go to the sex with Lysa again, but then he gives that wonderful line. You guys remember this line from Game of Thrones? It's a good one. I once told Ned Stark that when you find yourself naked with an ugly woman, the only thing to do is to close your eyes and get on with it. Love that fucking line. Fuck you, Littlefinger. Littlefinger seems to make up his mind and asks for a fortnight to finish up things in King's Landing before he sails for Gulltown. He gets up to depart, thinking that this has been such a wonderful morning, profitable even. He bows and leaves. Tyrion thinks. Tyrion heads up to the bedchamber to wait Varys and thinks the eunuch better hustle his powdered ass up as he wants to see Shade at night. So when Varys shows up an hour later, Tyrion is pleasantly surprised that the eunuch has arrived early. As soon as Varys walks in, he jokes around with Tyrion, saying that it was cruel not to tell Pycelle what was in the letter he dispatched. Tyrion says that it's ironic for you to say that, Varys, but you want to hear what my message to Doran was all about? Well, no need. Varys already knows from his little birds. Doran Martell has called banners, but he hasn't done anything else. Maybe he'll join up with Renly, and Tyrion will want to prevent that. Varys says with the confidence of like a CNN analyst or some shit. Tyrion's like, duh, dude, duh. So Varys wonders what Tyrion offered Doran Martell, given that the Prince of Dorne still mourns for his sister Elia. Well, Tyrion has offered up the empty small council seat, so recently vacated by Janos. Ed, fetch me a fucking block, Slynt. Varys wonders if that'll be enough to bring the Dornish to heel, but Tyrion's had another notion for that. He's going to give Doran Martell his sister Elia's killers, alive or dead after the war. This piques Varys' interest. The Master of Whispers knows who it was that killed Elia, and Tyrion knows too. It was an open secret at Casterly Rock that Gregor Clegane was the culprit. And even though Gregor is Tywin's man, Tywin will so totally make the rational call and exchange Gregor for 50,000 Doran spears. Varys considers this and muses that Doran may want the blood of the Lord who gave the command. What about that? Robert Baratheon led the rebellion. All commands came from him in the end. Robert was not at King's Landing, Varys says. Neither was Doran Martell, Tyrion replies. Varys says, so you're going to give blood and a council seat for the Dornish to join up with the Lannisters, but will Doran Martell take you up on the offer? He might want more, maybe a token of good faith. Tyrion sighed. You know, don't you? Since you put it that way, yes. Tommen, you could scarcely offer Myrcella to Dorne and Lysa Arryn both. Tyrion, doing some great acting here, says that he's irritated that Varys cheats at these games. He wants to get Tommen away from Cersei and Joffrey. He's a good boy, and he can grow to be a good man if he gets away from them, Tyrion says. Maybe even a good king? Varys is kind of like, hey, good king? Is that kind of something we want to be interested in? But Tyrion's not there yet. Joffrey is still the king to him. But Varys knows Tommen is the heir, and he's so very sweet and tractable. The problem, as Varys points out, is that Cersei won't want to part with Tommen or Myrcella. Tyrion can't send both away. But Cersei can't know. And that's why you can't tell her, Varys. And if Varys does tell Cersei, why Tyrion will know Varys to be his worst enemy. And when Varys giggled, Tyrion thought, 3. And that is A Clash of Kings, Tyrion IV. Call me crazy, but, last week's chapter on Bran 2 is full of wholesome, good faith, but still, hard-nosed northern politics with lords jostling for position and power. But ultimately, everyone's kind of working together, save for those motherfucking Boltons. There's a kind of level of trust here, but no, not in Tyrion 4. Like, this is gangster land, man, and you got to be a gangster to make it out of here alive. So, you being the gangster movie fanatic, what did you think of this chapter, Emmett?
Well, all these early Tyrion chapters are great, but this is the best of the best. Tyrion 4 is the Led Zeppelin 4, if you will, where all the elements from the previous chapters coalesce perfectly and attain new heights of political intrigue and intricate plotting. We could spend hours just praising the structure of it, as George keeps us dancing with specifics throughout the chapter before pulling the rug out at the very end with the reveal of what Tyrion's been up to all along. But every detail all along the way is notable in its own right, which is what allows this chapter to hold up so well on reread. It's not just the gotcha at the end. It's the context around that gotcha, and the density is the key to making that context work. And the accumulation of details at a take no prisoners momentum is, what keeps me coming back to Scorsese's gangster pictures as the reference point here, including now The Irishman, which if you haven't seen, you definitely should when it comes to Netflix at least, because it's just like 3.5 hours of men standing in shadowy corners mumbling things like, it is what it is, and he told me to tell you the thing. Or there's one line that I always get wrong, and I try to say it precisely. It's you might be demonstrating a failure to demonstrate respect, or something just beautifully, one of those beautiful self-negating gangster lines that doesn't mean anything except I'm going to kill you, dressed up in pretty language. And that's what I love about these Tyrion chapters. And this approach is common to most of the art I love in general, though. It's both overflowing with details and hurtling ahead at light speed.
Right. I mean, that level of granularity in Tyrion's chapters is what it makes them fun reads, right? I mean, it's fun to be like that in depth about stuff, but it's also makes them places where we need to not let our eyes kind of glaze over the text. George is planting seeds for larger plot movements with small mentions. In Tyrion 2, we saw with Varys doing the listicle of small matters. The Redwyne twins, they might flee if we don't arrest the person who's attempting to aid them. And in Tyrion 4, we have Bronn fulfilling the same role, listing off seemingly small matters that are actually going to pay off in big time down the road. And that's kind of George's skill as a writer at work. There are no unimportant matters here. I was watching Watchmen last night, and there's a mention of a device. I won't spoil it for those who haven't seen it. And this kind of long conversation that one of the characters has on the phone with a salesperson to possibly repair this device. And you think that's unimportant, but it's not unimportant. The same way it kind of works for George in A Clash of Kings and in Tyrion's chapter specifically. There are no unimportant matters. All of these small issues, these small things that are brought up that Bronn brings up, they become either fully imagined plot points down the road in A Clash of Kings, or they kind of work as seedlings for George to garden into full-blown future plot points. Plot points which, they're not actually going to sprout up into full-grown gardens until later books, Feast for Crows, A Dance with Dragons. It's similar to Bran 2 from last week, and how George just seeds future story points that won't manifest themselves until A Dance with Dragons, even The Winds of Winter. But those aren't the only parallels between Tyrion and Bran in this chapter.
Yes, it's wild coming to Tyrion 4 right after Bran 2, because they have so much in common in terms of structure, but they are so different in terms of the POV character arc at play. In both cases, George is taking us through a series of political figures, each with their own angle on the ever-shifting power plays of Westeros at war. Bran talks with Lord Wyman, Lady Hornwood, the Umber Uncles, etc., and Tyrion talks with Pycelle, Littlefinger, Varys, etc. And in both cases, we have this fledgling regime, the Stark and the Lannisters, trying to hold on to its legitimacy and secure needed allies, while also determining who is and who isn't trustworthy. But while Bran is, a good boy, a good lad, struggling to reshape his identity in a complex, hostile world, Tyrion is a much more ambiguous figure, working to just stay atop said complex, hostile world. Bran has on his side Sir Roderick and Maester Luwin, who are well-intentioned patriots who love him, even though, as we said with Stephen, their decisions aren't always the best. Tyrion has on his side Bronn, a merciless killer, and Podrick Payne, who can't even meet his gaze. And even in terms of family relations, Rickon may aggravate Bran a little bit in these class chapters, but he is nowhere near as much trouble as Cersei is for Tyrion. But of course, the primary difference is the age of our POVs, and how that determines their level of engagement with all the political maneuvering around them. Bran is just starting out, and so we see Winterfell politics through the eyes of someone longing for his childhood dreams to be restored instead. Someone with one eye always drifting out the window, you know what I mean? And Tyrion, he hasn't had anywhere near this much power before, but he is old enough to have read quite a bit and presumably observed players at work, especially his father. So this is his dream. reading people like his favorite books and moving them around on the board, proving he can master the society that has rejected him all his life. And while Bran, like Lewin and Roderick, is locked into a reactive mode of thinking, Tyrion is on the offense. He's weaponizing intelligence. He's using his pawn's strengths and weaknesses against them instead of just taking in the information. So if Bran's chapters filter the politics through coming-of-age tropes, Tyrion's chapters at their best burn right through Robert Caro to John le Carré, and he put these like political notions in a kind of spy noir, heightened emotional context, like in this chapter, all in service of George showing us how adults handle political power.
Yeah, you make a great point. And I think like last week we were emphasizing how George is like dispelling this notion of the North is like this pristine, amazing place where everybody works together for the common good of the realm. When that's actually not the case, right? We've got actual hard elbowed politics that are happening in the North too. But, you know, I do have to say, though, when we flash back to King's Landing, the very next chapter after Bran 2, we do get this, I'm going to say, a strong sense of a different type of political game being played here. And while it's worth emphasizing that the playing of the Game of Thrones in King's Landing requires a degree of cunning and deception and mistrust that Winterfell doesn't at least, you know, automatically require, it's more than just the locations and even the histories and the cultures at work and why the game feels different. You know, it comes down to, I want to say, Bran and Tyrion's individual point of views on the Game of Thrones. You know, in Bran 2, we've got Bran thinking that he had never asked to be a prince. It was knighthood he had always dreamed of. Bright armor and streaming banners, lance and sword, a war horse between his legs. Why must he waste his days listening to old men speak of things he only half understood? Because you're broken, a voice inside reminded him. A lord on his cushioned chair might be crippled. The Walder said their grandfather was so feeble that he had to be carried everywhere in a litter, but not a knight on a destrier. Besides, it was his duty. You are your brother's heir, and the Stark in Winterfell, Sir Roderick had said, reminding him of how Robb used to sit with their Lord Father when his bannermen came to see him. So that's Bran's perspective. Let's look at Tyrion from a later Tyrion chapter. It is real. All of it, he thought. The wars, the intrigues, the great bloody game, and me at the center of it. Me, the dwarf, the monster, the one they scorned and laughed at. But now I hold it all. The power, the city, the girl. This is what I was made for. And God's forgive me, but I do love it. You know, we need to consider like why these two are playing the Game of Thrones. You know, Bran is bored by the game, but he views his role as the Prince of Winterfell in stark terms. It's his duty. While Tyrion loves the game for its own sake and how it compensates for his physical disability, making him feel powerful and loved and respected, which is a major component of being a Lannister, right? You've got characters from Tywin who are reacting totally against his father Titus. You've got Cersei who's reacting against Tywin as well, and you compensate for different things that she is feeling inadequate as a result, mostly her sex and gender. So these are aspects about Tyrion and Bran, why we're looking at these two characters, and why I think that George, as we were saying in the pre-episode, placed them in these two chapters in conjunction with each other.
It's so sad because with Tyrion, he's more sympathetic in this regard than I think the other members of his family, because the treatment he's taken has been more constant than, I guess, more sympathetic than Tywin. I think Cersei is sympathetic to a certain degree in this regard too, in terms of the way they've been treated by society. But you also see Bran dealing with a lot of similar issues, and he comes out of it in a much better place. And I think you can see George trying to balance sympathy for these characters in terms of the position they've been put in, the hunger that's been inculcated in them, the drive to do better than their predecessors and belong in their family, but also pay attention to the damage they do along the way. Because, you know, the people who get stomped under Tyrion or Cersei's boots, what about their arcs? You know, what about their conflicts and their family histories? Don't they matter just as much? And what right do the Lannisters have to just, you know, take out their emotional issues on the landscape, as we've said before? And I think that's, as you say, I think George is working on different perspectives on that with Tyrion and Cersei and Tywin. But I think it's also worth noting that, like, compared to Jaime, like if Jaime at this point, well, not this point because he's in jail, but prior to being imprisoned by Robb, if Jaime wanted to just desert the Lannister cause because of how kind of noxious it was, he could just run off and be a sellsword like Robert dreams of doing. That's not exactly an easy route to take, but it's a possible route, and it's one that Tyrion really doesn't have. As he says, and as Tywin has made known to him, the life outside of being a Lannister of Casterly Rock is kind of an abyss for him, and we see that unfold over the course of A Dance with Dragons. So Tyrion does have fewer options, but it doesn't change the fact that George is showing us some much baser motivations going into his power.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, like, Jaime comes out of it with the best perspective when we get into his Storm of Swords, but it's still hugely problematic given all of the stuff that Jaime gets into, both in his backstory, as well as, of course, pushing Bran out of the window at the start of a Game of Thrones. Kind of bad. I know, controversial opinion as that is. But I think, like, when we look at all these different Lannisters and look at the way that they're interacting with politics, we do have Tyrion, who's occupying a smarter role. He kind of has the reputation for being the smarter Lannister. And we do see that on early display in this chapter, in our very first interaction that we have between Tyrion and the three possible, are they possible? Or are they actual fucking traitors in the small council with Grand Maester motherfucking Pycelle?
Indeed. So we get into the meat of the chapter, the three standoffs, the three showdowns with the members of the small council, and we begin appropriately on the bottom with the least impressive member of the small council now that Tyrion has gotten rid of Janos Slynt. And you see that at every turn in this scene, because Tyrion just sees right through Pycelle, the same way Ned did, but even more so. Manipulating him with such ease that he's like, his internal monologue keeps drifting throughout the scene. Like, he's thinking about the food and like the weather. It's just like, oh, those plums I would have cooked, those were watery and overcooked. He's not even focusing on what he's doing because it's so easy, because Pycelle is not a challenge. Whereas with Littlefinger and Varys, his internal monologue stays focused on them, on what he's doing. And while he does also make fun of them, as he does of Pycelle because he's Tyrion, he also expresses a reluctant respect for their abilities. He acknowledges in the privacy of his own head, okay, Littlefinger is good at armoring himself in his bookkeeping. Varys is good with his spies. He has no respect for Pycelle. That's not the case here. Tyrion has pure contempt for this man and is enjoying fucking with him just on that basis alone. We were talking about the family dynamics with the Lannisters, and given who Pycelle is really loyal to here, I wonder if part of Tyrion's contempt for Pycelle is that Tyrion knows that Pycelle is Tywin's toady and just worships him in just like a horrible snail kind of way. And wonder if he's just kind of subconsciously passing on his hatred for his father here. What do you think about that?
I do totally see that as the case, that Tyrion is projecting his own hatred on his father. At the same time, Pycelle is totally loathsome as a character. There's not a single scene with Pycelle in it where I'm like, wow, Pycelle makes great points. Until we get to A Feast for Crows, of course, when he is in Cersei's Small Council. And as we said before, he's the smartest member of Cersei's Small Council, showing how far the Small Council has fallen by the time we get to A Feast for Crows. If Tyrion is Tywin writ small, as he declares himself at the end of A Storm of Swords, maybe this is how Tywin views Pycelle too. Oh, sure, yeah, Pycelle is a total Lannister toady. Counseled Aerys to open the gates to Tywin, as he's going to reveal later in A Clash of Kings. And he helped Cersei bring Ned Stark down, all the different, and he does other things on behalf of the Lannisters. But you ever get the sense that Tywin is exceptionally fond of Pycelle? He sarcastically derides him as the venerable Grand Maester back in Tyrion's final chapter in A Game of Thrones. He otherwise acts like Pycelle is a nuisance in the spots that they're actually together in the Storm of Swords. So the idea that Tyrion is projecting this hatred of his father onto Pycelle works really well. But it's also, you could also have another aspect of hatred, another avenue for Tyrion to have hatred for Pycelle, as this guy that Tywin himself looks at and is like, I can't stand this. I guess he's like sort of important to my cause, but at the same time, he fucking sucks. Every single time I'm with this guy, he just bores me to tears and provides nothing of value to me in the small council.
Because he's such a kiss ass, and that's really unpleasant. It's really unctuous and unpleasant, even for someone with as inflated a self-image as Tywin Lannister. I just think of the line from Milhouse in The Simpsons, and he's thinking to himself about Lisa. Once she sees you'll do anything she asks, she's sure to respect you. It's like, that's Pycelle. Like, of course, he never, has his own just identity and his own bearing. He's always just thinking about how will the words escaping my mouth please the Lannister. And that's just, even if you're the Lannister, that's just obnoxious to be around. And that's why it's fun for us to read this scene. That's why it's fun to watch Tyrion puncture Pycelle, to mock his hypocrisy, his shallow sentiments, the utter transparency of his desire to get access to privileged information. He's bad at hiding his own desires, which is a problem. Of course, all that also reveals how cynical that Tyrion is. Like when Pycelle does his Pycelle sentiment, oh, people are starving outside, so I should keep my table, my table simple. And Tyrion says, I eat what we got, because who knows what we have on the morrow. That's Tyrion's mindset at this point. While that's, of course, Tyrion cracking a joke, it's also like, wow, that's bad if the guy in charge is cracking that kind of joke. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like, this entire chapter takes place in the context of the Lannister regime's fragility that Tyrion is desperately trying to shore up, dealing with the possibility that this is all going to collapse around their ears very soon. Like, Tyrion specifically doesn't even let Pycelle finish his breakfast, which is a power play, of course, but it's also just to communicate the urgency. Like, he specifically hurries Pycelle away from his table with the specter of Stannis and Renly, and they keep popping up. If you notice on reread, they haunt this chapter. Everyone's talking about them because they are just ready to crash down on the Lannister crew, one or the other. And Pycelle pushes back on Tyrion specifically in the name of Cersei and Joffrey, just to say, the king has the ultimate power, Cersei is the regent. But Tyrion definitely dodges him with a definition of power that conveniently puts him in charge. First he says, the council is subordinate to the king. And then Pycelle says, okay, so what about the king? What about Joffrey? And then Tyrion says, oh, well, but Joffrey's a kid. So really he's subordinate to me, his hand. Okay. Which is an interesting construction. Like any good politician, Tyrion is presenting his definition of power as the natural conception of power, right? Common sense. I'm in charge. But power is a shadow on a wall. Power is where you believe it resides. Power always has multiple definitions. And you could easily reach a different definition here, the one that Pycelle is going for, where Cersei is in charge as the regent. And that's why Tyrion has to be an effective LBJ-ish politician in the moment. He has to bowl right over Pycelle. He doesn't even let Pycelle finish a sentence for most of this scene. And that's on purpose. And then he gives him a blast of the old mismatched eyes, which he says, always he uses to intimidate people. And it works on Pycelle, at least for the moment, to get him through the scene, to get Pycelle. He's not even trying to get Pycelle to be loyal so much as to get Pycelle to perform loyalty so then Tyrion can catch him in betrayal. You know what I mean? He's trying to get Pycelle to play along just enough. So he takes advantage of Pycelle's misogyny while internally disagreeing that Cersei is a, quote, frail dove. You see that also with Catelyn back in book 1, when Rickard Karstark claims that women are the gentler sex, and then Catelyn brings up Cersei as the counterexample. And we get a lot of character information, great little lines. We're not getting much plot-wise from this one as compared to the other conversations with Littlefinger and Varys. All we learn from this is that Tyrion is sending some kind of message to the Martells. And we don't learn the details, of course, because this is the real one. So we'll learn the details later. George can afford to hold us off on that because, that's going to become an actual plot line. But Tyrion also has to keep the details secret because he specifically needs to know if Pycelle is reading the messages. Right? Like if Pycelle just passes on something Tyrion directly told him, that's one thing. But if Pycelle is breaking operational security, if he's reading the messages Tyrion gave him, then Pycelle can't be trusted on a whole other level.
Right. But at the same time, though, it's amusing here. And I did skip this over the synopsis, to be honest. Tyrion observes one blackbird flying away. So Pycelle sends one raven away to Dorne, probably, right? To keep up the pretense that he's doing as Tyrion bids. But, as much as we're praising Tyrion's intelligence here versus Pycelle, which again is not, it's kind of a mountain versus a kind of a grain of sand sort of thing in terms of smarts going on, what's going on here. But maybe Tyrion should have known that Pycelle immediately betrayed him by the fact that it was one bird instead of two. Like, I know this seems like a very minor point, but listen, here's the quote. Pycelle moved so slowly that Tyrion had time to finish his egg and taste the plums, overcooked and watery to his taste, before the sound of wings prompted him to rise. He spied the raven dark in the dawn sky. And remember, Tyrion had 2 copies of the letter and wanted 2 birds sent out. As he says, 1 letter and 2 copies. Send your swiftest birds. The matter is of great import. So for all of Tyrion's cunning, we get the small hint that Tyrion may not be the greatest player as he imagines himself to be. Like, he should immediately know that Pycelle betrayed him because he only sent 1 letter forward instead of sending the 2 letters forward that Tyrion asked for. So at the same time, though, you do get the sense that Tyrion wants to kind of sense out the rest of the small counselors and figure out they're betraying him too. But he should have been like, yeah, okay, Pycelle is obviously the one of the traitors in the court. One of them, just one of them.
I love that George has just a detail he can include in just for our benefit, not even Tyrion's. That's how many details he's packed into this chapter. He can afford just to give us one. And that is a wonderful little touch that shows Pycelle is rotten to the core. So before we transition from Pycelle to Littlefinger, the next in the 1, 2, 3 conga line, we get this little power walk with Bronn. And before Bronn brings Tyrion up to speed, we get this little comic moment with Bronn choosing to watch the swordplay among the men training rather than hit on the ladies walking past. And Tyrion makes fun of him for it. And Bronn talks about I can get laid anywhere, but I got to focus on these guys because they might kill me. And there's an interesting contrast there that comes up a lot, not just in the Song of Ice and Fire, but all across literature, all across art. This contrast of the needs of war with the flesh-bound needs of the individual. Stannis going to war versus Renly's Peach. You know what I mean? Like Jorah's Peach versus the situation he's in now with Dany. Or even the contrast between the food that Pycelle and Tyrion are talking about, like the needs of the now, the needs of sating your beastly belly versus the long-term needs of the war. In this case, Bronn knows where his bread is buttered. A younger Bronn might have just gone after the ladies because he didn't have to care about focusing on those men because he wasn't in an institutional position to care. But now he is. Now this is his job. So he's a different man. And I love that Tyrion points out, hey, these guys are on our side. Like, you're not going to have to fight them. And you can just imagine Bronn smirking like, sure, they're on our side today.
Yep.
But we're in a civil war, and he seems to understand more than Tyrion that, yeah, he could easily end up on the other side of the war from them. Just look at what's going on with Renly and Stannis right now. These things move so quickly, you don't necessarily know. And so you get this little walk and talk meeting with Tyrion, this little West Wing walk and talk, or pick a show with politics less obnoxious, but that kind of sharp back and forth dynamic. And it gets what we've talked about before. The Clash of Kings is not only about power, but about different conceptions of power and how they compete, both in universe and for our attention as readers. So you get these again comic interludes about like marriage prospects for Tyrion, but they exist alongside reports of starvation inside the city and war crimes outside it. And the point is that for Tyrion and Bronn, there's no difference. For they are just talking about this in a neutral tone, all our items on the agenda with no moral valence, which, I've interned a little bit on Capitol Hill and for some other big institutions. And this is how people talk. And it's kind of chilling after a while. Like, George makes you understand why Tyrion has adopted this mindset, but without necessarily excusing it. He takes you through the logic of the decision making while also making you aware of the callousness of many of these decisions. Like Tyrion's response to his father's string of atrocities in the Riverlands, I believe they call that war. What an obnoxious thing to say. First of all, for someone who's not experiencing any of it, and someone who's getting food brought into him in the city that's starving all around him, but also just completely blithely ignoring how Tywin has deliberately ramped up the terror and ramped up the atrocities in the Riverlands. And this is the same mindset that led Tyrion to casually plan on reducing the Vale to a smoking wasteland to work out his private vendetta with the Arryns. He really has no concern about the people starving, nor about the mobs forming in the city outside, trying to work out brutal justice on those withholding food from them. There is always a short-term, crude Machiavellian logic to Tyrion's moves here. He can explain to us that, yes, compliant riverlords have their uses. Yes, Littlefinger can deal with these creditors better than Joffrey. Yes, feeding the mob today might guarantee a bigger one tomorrow, and so on and so forth. He's not just like Joffrey, just like doing things for sadistic fun. But every step along the way, George is pointing out that the long-term effects of this way of approaching politics, and none of these long-term effects are good. Starvation gets worse. The Gold Cloaks are joining the mob, which is a very fateful detail we get in this chapter. Everything is falling apart. And Joffrey being a loose cannon who always has to be managed is bad news in the long run, even if you can manage him in the short run. And just so George wants you to get this, that even though Tyrion's methods are effective in the short term but not in the long term, just in case you haven't understood it, at the end of the scene, Tyrion brushes off word of the apocalypse because he doesn't like the messenger, because he doesn't like Alistair Thorne, and for the want of a nail, the whole world turned to ice.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating point because, talking about the Riverlord, you never get the sense that Tyrion feels like a twinge of sympathy or a twinge of guilt over what his family is doing. It's simply encased in terms as, this is just war. This is what happens in war, right? This is just the natural progression of war. But no, that's actually not how war is supposed to be fought, both in this universe as well as in the real world, as we talked about back in Tyrion 9. Tyrion's Tywin-esque Machiavellianism, as you point out, as his moral center here in Clash, it works as terrific foreshadowing for what Tyrion will become in A Dance with Dragons and likely into The Winds of Winter too. There's no Machiavellian greater good dynamic in work in Tyrion's Syvass game with young Griff, where he manipulates the boy to invade Westeros without Daenerys or dragons aboard the Shy Maid. Instead, you've written this really, really well. Tyrion is playing young Griff for nihilistic kicks, enjoying the game for its own sake. Kind of like Littlefinger does, as we're going to find out at the end of this chapter. It's a Littlefingering move, as again, you and other folks like Adam Feldman have pointed out in your various essays. One of my appreciations for A Clash of Kings is noticing George working at the margins of Tyrion's story to make his villainous turn more palatable and more believable. And this is how good character twists work. It makes a sympathetic character have little wrinkles, just teeny tiny little things in their outlook that you kind of side-eye for the moment, but you push it aside, right? Because Tyrion is the protagonist in The Clash of Kings. We're all rooting for Tyrion. We don't want Tyrion to die, right? Maybe not anymore. But it's all set up for the future dark turn George has in mind for Tyrion in Dance. And as George said in 1999, as we've quoted a couple times now, Tyrion, well, he's the villain after all. And when did he say this? Again, 1999. Right around the time after A Clash of Kings was published. So this is very early in George's conception of Tyrion Lannister, and it helps to kind of set us in this mode that we think that, Tyrion's kind of a bad guy and supporting a bad cause. Not just that he's supporting a bad cause, but he's rationalizing evil actions as war, as politics, when I guess it is in one sense, but it's the immoral, evil kind of war and politics.
It's the antagonist inside the protagonist, and George does such a good job of suggesting both. Because, yeah, we're comparing Tyrion constantly to Cersei and Joffrey, and even Tywin, and he does come off relatively good compared to them. And a lot of his sins, when you come back to a chapter like this, are mostly sins of omission, ones you might not necessarily catch on first read. The lack of sentiment, the lack of emotion, the lack of concern. Callousness is harder to pick up on than obvious, jaw dripping with blood sadism, right? But you come back on reread knowing where Tyrion's going, and it really stands out. And that is a testament to the strength of George's writing, of the patience he had with Tyrion, taking his time and building that character arc. But speaking of petty personal ego swamping all other concerns, here's Cersei. Cersei just kind of shows up for a little bit in this chapter. She's not as involved in what's happening as she will be in the next few Tyrion chapters in Clash. But we still get that great Tyrion-Cersei dialogue I've talked about before, where they just immediately piss each other off and start poking at old wounds. And that's not to say that at an institutional level they would ever be allies. As Tyrion notes, Cersei was never going to be happy about how he handled Janos Slynt. But that they are constantly at each other's throats when they don't need to be is bad for the Lannister cause in general. Even if it wasn't Cersei who ordered Tyrion killed at the Blackwater, although I half think it was. And I can't exactly say that Tywin makes it any better when he shows up to crack heads together in a storm of swords. I do like the pattern in A Clash of Kings of Cersei constantly being a step behind Tyrion in terms of intelligence gathering. Like there's this constant where like Tyrion will do something or learn something, and then Cersei will turn up like waving her finger about it and reacting to it a chapter or two later. And this produces comic moments like Cersei telling Tyrion that she's more concerned about the defenses than him, which is just laughable on reread when we know what that chain is for, and that Cersei, if anything, sabotaged the defenses repeatedly while Tyrion saved the city. Now, to give Cersei some credit, because Cersei does have a couple of good moves, she is right that taking the red wines hostage was a significant contribution to the Lannister cause. There was a whole another AU where the red wines were in with Renly from the start, where it's a completely different ballgame. But as Tyrion also notes, Loras Tyrell really was the bigger fish to fry there in terms of keeping the Reach out the war. And everywhere else, he's on a deeper level than Cersei. He knows why it's dumb to bring Tywin's army to King's Landing. As he says, that would serve no purpose but to make you feel better. He understands Renly's strategy. He explains it very cogently, more than Renly bothers to himself. And he also knows why Stannis is more of a threat in spite of Renly's strategy, because the problem with Renly's strategy is it allows other people to reshape the board. That's why he has to react to Stannis showing up at Storm's End, leaving his infantry in the dust. And that's the hole he leaves open. And Tyrion, of course, doesn't know what Stannis is going to do, but he understands, Stannis has a move yet to make, and he's cunning, so that move might be a big one. I got to keep my eye on that, and Renly's going to take his time. Again, Martin is immersing us in his understanding of the politics of his entire fictional world through the lens of Tyrion and what Tyrion makes of all of this.
Yeah, you make a great point. Like, he is immersing us in that, and he's also, I want to say he's doing a good job also of, again, expanding out the world in such a way and starting to kind of move different threads together. So one of the things I think is interesting about this chapter and the fact of the Red Wine Fleet. The Red Wine Fleet is going to be like this major thing in A Storm of Swords, and then A Feast for Crows, and then The Winds of Winter, where they're kind of going back and forth across Westeros, right? They're sailing around the Arm of Dorne to get up to besiege Dragonstone. Then they sail immediately right back down to Dorne when they actually take Dragonstone, and Euron is upsetting things, let's say slightly upsetting things in the Reach. Here we're also seeing George doing the same thing here, where we have the Red Wine Fleet staying back at the Arbor and not moving to assist with the Lannister regime at Westeros. And this allows Stannis to move his fleet and invade Storm's End. And then later they're going to come up after the Red Wines after the Tyrells rather join with the Lannister cause. And then we have, them moving back down south again after Euron shows up in A Feast for Crows. So these are all, like, you're starting to see, like, George kind of expanding the plot as well as making it more complex and complicated. And the Red Wine Fleet is a very minor thing in the grand scale of things, but it becomes much more major later on in the story. I also think it's really interesting too. You bring up this point about Cersei being a step behind Tyrion. This is something that, you kind of get the sense maybe that Varys is telling Tyrion things first and letting him understand what's going on before he tells Cersei, because he wants to be like, okay, here, I'm going to tell the one guy that I'm really working with here, really working hard to try and make him a part of our little young Griff plot later on in the Dance with Dragons. But at the same time, like, he does have to tell Cersei too, and that's all working together to make a really interesting plot point where you have Varys kind of playing both sides and maybe possibly doing some other things on the side as well, as we'll get to later in A Clash of Kings. But
that's
then
a good point. I hadn't considered that. That's a good point. Obviously, I think Tyrion is a little more cunning than Cersei in general, but yeah, Varys is also privileging him with information, and Tyrion is taking full advantage of that. But before we get to Varys, of course, we get to Littlefinger, who is introduced in this chapter in just the most over-the-top villainous fashion imaginable, just leaning back, with his plum doublet on in his yellow cape, sitting back to watch the king kill animals for fun. It isn't that just Joffrey in a nutshell, by the way. It's pointless bloodletting, and he's not even good at it. He's not even effective at it in like a Maegor sort of way. He almost castrates one of his own Kingsguard in this scene, which I had forgotten. And as with Tyrion's jarring lack of concern for the hellscape we've seen up close in Arya's last chapter, this is meant to frame the politicking, right? Let's give it a context. Even as George draws us into the details of Tyrion's plans with Littlefinger, he never wants us to forget the king it's all supporting. If you think about it in terms of like a shot in a movie, you'd have like Tyrion and Littlefinger, like, in the center of the frame in the foreground. You can imagine like Joffrey shooting crossbow bolts just out of focus in the background. But so you always know it's there. So you always remember it's happening. That's what's going on here. And Littlefinger's response to that is the most Littlefinger thing ever. Invest in pots, pod. Monetize the rot. Always be closing, even as Rome burns. Castles are for winners. And Littlefinger, of course, is someone who always thinks through the double implications of his words like that. There's always something under the surface. That's why you get the hilarious moment in this scene when Tyrion says he's going to give Lysa Jon Arryn's true killer. And Littlefinger's response is, true killer, I confess, you make me curious. What a word choice on his part and George's part to sneak a little confession into his obfuscation. So this opening statement of ideology, invest in pots. This is his shot across Tyrion's bow, right? This is him saying, this is how I think. This is his way of differentiating himself from someone like Pycelle. I am not to be trifled with. And Tyrion knows that, even as he goes on to manipulate Littlefinger. After all, this is personal, not just business. Tyrion knows that Littlefinger framed him, and Littlefinger knows that Tyrion knows. And as Tyrion points out, Littlefinger is not concerned about that in the slightest. Mm-hmm. And part of that is just the thrill that Littlefinger gets from courting disaster. Part of it is also, to be honest, George's thumb on the scale, keeping Tyrion from executing Littlefinger, because George needs Littlefinger to stay around for plot. But it is also grounded in the material realities of government in King's Landing, in which Littlefinger has invested so much, literally and otherwise, over the years. To come back to the comparison to Bran 2, this is Littlefinger playing the Wyman Manderley role, right? He's the modern financial thinker out to vertically integrate the state. The crown's money will not simply sit in the vault like a dragon's hoard. No, the crown must become a lender, a speculator, a landlord, a central cog in all the industries, a thumb in every pie. And this is indeed how a federal state can evolve into a federal state. This is indeed how a feudal state can evolve into an early modern one. And the problem is that Littlefinger is going considerably farther than Wyman's benign patriotic profiteering. Littlefinger is rigging the entire government to explode. Nothing in his books is reliable, as Tyrion learns in The Storm of Swords, because all the people who would tell on him owe him their jobs. And knowing him, they probably owe him their lives. Mm-hmm. Wyman wants to help his new kingdom grow and become secure. Littlefinger wants to be able to cripple the central government at will on behalf of his new patron, which by the time of Winds of Winter is shaping up to be Queen Sansa of Northern Vale. As we've said before, it's this kind of like gruesome, cynical take on rags to riches story in fantasies. Like, the scrappy, intelligent, lower-class kid working his way to the top, but he has no aim beyond destruction and jealous possession.
Yeah, it's funny, right? I mean, like, this is our primary source on what Littlefinger was doing after he was expelled from River Run, which we find out from Catelyn's 6th chapter from A Game of Thrones. And that kind of brings up something, though, even though we know a little bit about what happens, there is a gap in our knowledge. There's a gap in terms of what Littlefinger was doing between 7 years, 282 and 289 AC. We only know during that time two things. One, that Littlefinger went back to the Fingers after Hoster Tully dismissed him, and we know that he wrote Catelyn a letter at some point in between those years that she later burned. But we really have no idea what else was going on. But then suddenly he reappears in 289 when Lysa entreats on Jon Arryn to appoint him as the customs officer in Gulltown. And then he turns out to be a surprise economic prodigy. What was he doing for those 7 years, right? There's nothing in his background or his backstory that we learn from his fostering in River Run that leads us to say, like, yeah, this guy is definitely going to be this financial genius who's able to manipulate the markets, manipulate the government, and manipulate the treasury in such a way as to bring ruin to all of King's Landing and all of Westeros as a whole. My theory. So I have a theory about this. Driven, of course, because all theories, and this is something that's was brought up in a recent Storm of Swords podcast about theories about Lost. All theories should point to a character reason or a character motivation, like an idea of a hypothesis should have a character end state when it comes to narrative fiction. So my theory, I think driven by his burning hatred of Hoster Tully and the nobility, he makes a grand study of the nobility and determines that the nobles are shit at finance. Then he finds people who are talented in these areas and puts them into positions of power, making them his allies using monetary corruption as his leverage point. We get this quote from the chapter. They were men of middling birth by and large, merchant sons, lesser lordlings, sometimes even foreigners, but judging from their results, far more able than their high-born predecessors. I do wonder kind of whether these men are aware that they are co-conspirators with Littlefinger's plan to bring down Westeros, crashing on the nobles, or are they kind of like, the mafia from The Dark Knight, which is the only movie that millennials know these days. Guys who are just interested in enriching themselves off a rotten system, who don't realizing who or what they're getting into bed with. So that's kind of like my general hypothesis. We got 7 years where Littlefinger just educates the shit out of himself. As we were saying in pre-production, it's kind of like 7 years. You got your 4 years of undergrad, you got your 3 years for your master's degree. Littlefinger at that point is a master of finance. He's a master of manipulation. He's a master of putting people in the best positions that he can get his own ends at. So he puts himself high and above these nobles. And yet at the same time, he's making himself to be a friend to everyone. As George said, Littlefinger is the most different character from the books to the show because, in the books, Littlefinger is the friend to everyone. But at the same time, is he really the friend to everyone? If he's a friend to everyone, he might be a friend to no one.
Precisely. And even the people he's not a friend to, he's made sure along the way to make himself indispensable to them. He is indispensable to his current patrons by A, being the only one to understand finance, and B, presenting himself as unthreatening, as lower class, disreputable, the kind of guy who would know about finance. And by the time someone with a more jaundiced eye about that sort of thing than Cersei or Tywin comes along, it's too late to do anything about it, especially with a war on. A war Littlefinger helped instigate because the war protects him. The war ensures that Tyrion thinks, I don't have the time to completely root him out and reshape the entire government structure of King's Landing because a Baratheon army is about to land on the doorstep. I just can't do it. All of which goes to explain why Tyrion feels he cannot touch him. Instead, he hopes to make use of him. But he knows that Littlefinger is not going to be a pushover like Pycelle. And this is where we find Tyrion as a more adept politician than Ned, because Ned pretty much just has the one strategy. And I admire it, and I think it's more effective than people give him credit for. And I think he was mostly brought down by combination of bad luck and timing and lots of factors, as we discussed in our coverage of Game of Thrones. But what Tyrion has all over Ned is his multiplicity of strategies and his ability to shift his strategy to meet a new target. Where Tyrion cut Pycelle off, he spars with Littlefinger back and forth. Where Tyrion's mind wandered while Pycelle blathered, he runs over Littlefinger's dossier constantly in his mind because he knows that's who he's dealing with here. It's much more one-on-one. And that is how he's able to zero in on Lysa and Harrenhal as the keys to Littlefinger's compliance. And I love how much time George takes to describe Tyrion's awareness of Littlefinger's tics. Like Tyrion just takes such pleasure in watching it play across Littlefinger's face. Littlefinger realizes what he could have and then realizes, I'm giving away my desire for it, and then goes, I can't help myself. Like all that plays across Littlefinger's face. It was clearly like less than a second, but Tyrion takes it all in. And it helps that they have something in common, these two, and both of them are just extremely cynical. Like neither one is considering Lysa as a person. Both are just lying throughout this conversation about what they've done and what they're intending to do. And everyone loves that part where Tyrion just feigns distress about his own guerrilla activities. But it's also chilling. Like that's a real world government thing. Like two powerful people talking about the guerrilla movements they are inspiring and are disavowing and are like pretending to cover up and deal with. You're kidding yourself if we think our state isn't doing that kind of thing all the time. But again, the difference is that Tyrion and Littlefinger, not the difference. The important thing is that Tyrion and Littlefinger are talking very shallowly about it and are not taking it seriously. We have moved on from Pycelle's false pieties, the pretense of taking it seriously, to a showdown of pure snark between these two. And that's what makes it fun, but also, I think, depressing.
Yeah, it is very depressing when you have these guys being like, sucks for Lysa that she has to have all of these mountain clansmen killing the shit out of the Vale. That's so terrible. It's not, but I arm them, of course, as Tyrion thinks. I also think it's interesting too in this section how we see the mask kind of drop a little bit for Littlefinger. You mentioned his like facial tics. He's like Tyrion's picking up on things. Like we're seeing Littlefinger's imagine endgame kind of springing to his mind. It's like, well, I don't actually have to do all of these things that I planned in the long term because I could just get Harrenhal given to me for doing this one little thing. And, there's a sense that, these guys are operating as peers. I think like a lot of people have this idea that Littlefinger is some sort of master player in the Game of Thrones. And yes, he is very good at it. But as Tyrion it makes clear in this section of the chapter, he's not perfect at the game. He is letting himself be seen by Tyrion. And Tyrion is, by seeing these things in Littlefinger, is able to kind of pick out what is working, what isn't working in terms of his manipulation of him. And that's fun, I guess, for me to have Littlefinger kind of get his kind of chopped off at the knees. It's fun. It's fun. I'm just saying it's fun. But it's, that also then takes us to our next section. So we have the parody with Littlefinger. What happens when the third counselor shows up in the small council chambers with Tyrion?
Yes, and now we arrive at the top of the mountain, the greatest player of them all, Varys the Spider. And with Varys, we see Tyrion once more shifting his strategy. Like he's just sitting and waiting for Varys, knowing that Varys will come to him, which speaks so much to how he's playing Varys. Like he bowled over Pycelle, right? He's sparred on even terms with Littlefinger, but he's waiting for Varys. He's going blank for Varys. Like if you imagine, someone said this and I forget who, but like the core act of politics is just trying to be able to read someone's mind. And that the reason politics is so complex is because we can't. Like that's where we have to build an entire political system around, is just being able to look at the other person in the room and go, what are you thinking? And so if you think about these three showdowns between Tyrion and the counselors as that made literal, like psychic duels while trying to read the other person's mind. Tyrion just bowls right over Pycelle and immediately reads his mind and knows what's going on and gets bored. Tyrion and Littlefinger are trying to read each other's mind, and both are kind of semi-successful in bouncing back and forth. But with Varys, Tyrion knows that he's going up against someone who is better at mind reading than he is, so he puts his mind on blank. So he lets Varys in and lets Varys fill him up with his own assumptions. And that's how Varys gets ahead of himself. Tyrion knows that Varys will already have spied out the offers he made via Pycelle and Littlefinger. And rather than coming up with a false story that Varys will see through, he allows Varys to reach his own false conclusion regarding Tommen. And this is so smart because it uses Varys' primary advantage against him. And even with that deceit, there's a certain candor here between Tyrion and Varys, more so with Littlefinger and much more so than with Pycelle. Many Tyrion chapters in Clash kind of have this structure where he starts with the mask intact and it gradually slips over the course of the chapter as he gets more frustrated and full of doubt and regret, like we saw with Bronn in the Janos Slynt chapter, or he gets more kind of into it as he gets here. And here he finally exposes his aim all along as the chapter ends. He wants to see who is more loyal to Cersei than to him. That's what this whole thing has been about. All the details were smokescreen and traps, all to get to that one idea. Who is reporting to Cersei before me? And it's a brilliantly executed plan. And it's necessary, given how Cersei conducts herself politically, as George helpfully reminds us in this chapter. But at the same time, I think you can come back on reread and see how Tyrion is setting himself up for failure here. Like, Pycelle will remember this, and it will prompt his damning testimony at the trial. Littlefinger, too, will act with renewed vengeance to bring Tyrion down. And ironically, he sets out to ensure over the rest of Clash and Storm that he gets Harrenhal and he gets Lysa's hand, almost as a fuck you to Tyrion, like, I'm going to get the exact prizes you thought I would never have. And even Tyrion's genuine offer, the one to the Martells, smart as it is to reach out for allies in this moment, it opens up a huge can of worms for his family that we're still seeing unfold in the released chapters of The Winds of Winter. And again, it's all against the backdrop of Joffrey as a sadistic child king and the threat of the others going completely ignored. So you have Tyrion as this great, on-the-ground politician, this great guy who comes up with these strategies as to how to handle these counselors. But every time you finish a Tyrion chapter in Clash, you're left with the question of, like, wait, what just actually happened, though? Mm-hmm. Did he actually change things? Is the government better now, or do we just have, like, a fun scene? And I think that's deliberate. I think that's George showing us at the end of these chapters, Tyrion isn't delivering the justice he promised he would, really.
Right. I mean, you can look at my display name here on the YouTube livecast, but it's Bran greater than signed Tyrion. So yeah, ultimately they are fun chapters. They're a lot of fun. They're like dessert, right? As we were saying. They're fun. I mean, I just have a lot of fun talking about Tyrion and talking about his manipulations of these different small counselors, but they don't ultimately satisfy. We're seeing Tyrion in a vaguer sense, even in its own chapter, even in isolation from knowing what's going to happen in Tyrion's arc come the end of A Clash of Kings, into Storm of Swords, and into A Dance with Dragons. We can see the parameters for Tyrion going bad here. It's not Tyrion isn't actually doing good in the long term. I think one of the interesting things that we have this like really subtle conversation piece in this chapter that ends this chapter, where Varys and Tyrion are talking about Joffrey and talking about Tommen, and they're talking about how Joffrey is this manipulative sociopath that, they kind of, Varys like hinting like maybe we should get rid of him and put Tommen in his place, but it's not for the benefit of Westeros. It's not for the benefit of King's Landing. It's not even for the benefit of, I don't know, House Lannister as a whole. It's because he's more pliable, more tractable. He's able to be manipulated more by these power players in King's Landing. And that's ultimately where I come down to, like, why I think the Bran's chapters are better than Tyrion's chapters, because there's a bit of, it's filling, it's fulfilling in terms of how Bran is operating and how the people that are coming to Bran with petitions and different ideas that they want to do in the new kingdom in the north, how they want to actually operate. And yes, they are, they're hard elbows. They are attempting to use their position to advance their own house, their own cities, their own castles' interests. But at the same time, they're ultimately Northern patriots, as you pointed out before earlier in this podcast. And it being patriotic for the North, they're more enjoyable to kind of think about and analyze, and opposed to these all shells of human beings that are manipulating the political process to fuck Westeros over in terms of Littlefinger and Varys. I mean, Varys might self-delude himself to say that he's in it for the good of the realm and for the children, but ultimately what he's doing is bringing more disaster, more death, and more destruction. Same as Tyrion too.
Well said, sir. And I think that just about wraps us up for the chapter content itself of A Clash of Kings Tyrion IV. Why don't you take us away to foreshadowing and groundwork, sir?
Absolutely. So in this chapter, we've got Tyrion slipping a little teeny tiny little vial up his sleeve as Pycelle is off betraying him with the sending the one bird to Dorne. And Tyrion is going to use that poison that he steals from Pycelle just a couple chapters from now. And it will come up again at his trial on a Storm of Swords, as Pycelle will testify that Tyrion has robbed him of his medicines. And Tyrion's plot in King's Landing, it seems pretty well plotted out from the start of A Clash of Kings. You get this sense that George has some very clear ideas of where he's going. We're past a little bit beyond the guarding stage and more into the architectural stage, and that he is very much has a very clear sense of ideas of where he's going to go in this chapter and where he's going to go in Tyrion's arc in A Clash of Kings.
Well put. I think the garden versus architectural contrast is a great one for these Tyrion chapters, because he does seem to have a very firm hand on the details here. Like the lack of food coming into King's Landing, that's something we constantly see in these Tyrion and Sansa chapters early on in Clash, and that pays off in a big way with the bread riots in Tyrion 9. And that's important to have there, not just for nerdy details so we can go back and point it out and feel clever about ourselves. That's just a side benefit. But I mean, the main reason is so it feels organic. It feels like a real city boiling over when it happens in Tyrion 9. And that's crucial to the excitement of that scene. It doesn't just feel like the author hit the riot now button. You know what I mean?
Right. I mean, you have the seeds of the riot just germinating from various events. We learned from Tyrion 3 that the Stokeworks and the Rosbys are the only two houses that are sending food to King's Landing, and they're small houses. Everything else is basically cut off. You've got a worsening food situation. You've got this idea that we've got a teeny tiny little murder of a baker who may have possibly been putting sawdust into the bread, and the Gold Cloaks are joining in. And you're like, huh. So what is this all building to, George? What is it all building to? Well, it's building to a massive fucking riot that's going to almost overthrow Joffrey before Stannis and or Renly can even arrive in King's Landing.
Absolutely. It's going to be it's really interesting to see how the starvation of King's Landing and the mood of the small folk pays off with the spare movement. But I'm getting ahead of myself with getting to A Feast for Crows.
Absolutely. Speaking of A Feast for Crows, we also see this Stokeworth plot is going to crop up again here. It shows up here with the fate of, again, poor Lalas, who is probably one of the biggest victims from the riot in King's Landing, that is used to motivate Bronn during Tyrion's trial and throughout A Feast for Crows, where they utilize lollies as, you can marry, Bronn, rather they're going to utilize Bronn as a means of marrying lollies to marry into the noble class. And along kind of the same foreshadowing line, we get this line from Tyrion, which I kind of glossed over in the synopsis, which is Tyrion says to Bronn, perhaps you should eat the goose and marry the maid, of course, being lollies. And so a question for you, do you think that George had this idea that Bronn would marry lollies in mind when he wrote A Clash of Kings?
It's possible. I mean, Bronn's social climbing is such a constant in Clash and Storm, and the Stokeworth marriage plot is left dangling, especially after the riot. So maybe, I'm curious if he always planned for it to be handled off screen the way it ended up being in A Feast for Crows. Maybe he intended to have a closer look at it at some point. That's an interesting question to pose to George at some point down the line. But speaking of stuff being set up for A Feast for Crows, there's just so much set up in this chapter. It's one of those, again, like Bran 2, where there's just tons of foreshadowing going on. We get this mention of Braavosi moneylenders starting to sniff around King's Landing and demand payments on Robert's loans. And that's going to return with a vengeance in Cersei's chapters in A Feast for Crows. But of course, it's not the Iron Bank doing it yet, because the Iron Bank doesn't exist in George's mind. These are just Braavosi moneylenders. In case, again, where you sometimes if you don't have an exact arc in mind for an institution or part of the setting, start generic, right? Start mysterious. Start with just Bravosi moneylenders and give yourself room to grow. And if George never wanted to do anything with that, part of the plot line ever again, he never committed anything to it. Unlike, say, those Tyroshi sellswords who just vanish in between book 1 and 2, where he kind of committed himself and then forgot. This is, I think, a smarter move of hedging your bets.
Yeah, I agree there. It allows for George to build this plot up later in A Feast for Crows, which is a great subplot that we get with Cersei expelling Tycho Nestoris, and then Tycho showing up with Stannis being like, fine, fuck you. I'm going to go back Stannis. And the Iron Bank is pro Stannis going on forward because he's the one who's actually going to pay the debts back to us, as we find out at the end of A Dance of Dragons, starting into Theon's Winds of Winter sample chapters. Finally, in terms of foreshadowing and groundwork, we have Sir Talad. You guys remember him? No? No, oh, it's okay. Don't worry about it. So Talad is one of those other elements that George is planning here and kind of makes use of later on. He's going to escort Shay to the trial, and then he's going to be one of those accused of being Marjorie Tyrell's lovers in A Feast for Crows. Like, basically, this is in the same way that Bran 2 was foreshadowing for events from A Dance of Dragons. Tyrion 4 is foreshadowing for events for A Feast for Crows, primarily. This is what this entire chapter is all about. Basically, A Feast for Crows.
Yes, you can see George plotting out not just Tyrion's arc, but a lot of events in King's Landing going for the next couple books. And not even just plotting them out, but introducing elements that he will later draw from, as we're saying. Certainly, Sir Talad is a minor character. George definitely doesn't have those things in mind. But he's just of a cast of characters, and George restrains himself from just inventing new ones every time. He goes back, it's like, who have I mentioned before? Who's a minor character that I can mention again that'll make this universe feel lived in on reread? And so, yeah, especially Marjorie's quote-unquote suitors in The Feast for Crows feel just like just a complete list of all the minor characters in King's Landing. Jalabar Zoe is there, and the Red Wine Twins. It's like everyone who's just been flooding around the background gets called in, because that's your use of your tertiary characters. They don't have to do anything, but when you need a group of people for an event, they're there for when you need them. And I think George knows how to handle that sort of thing.
He absolutely does. So I think about wraps this up for our foreshadowing groundwork portion of this chapter. To kind of walk us into our kind of larger discussion piece, I figure I would start with a very bold statement, because I'm very, very brave, as everyone says, and which I'm going to say that, this scene in the show is better than as portrayed here in Tyrion IV. Did I blow your mind?
Oh, yes, right. Shock. I'm supposed to perform shock and surprise when Jeff does his opinions. Right. Oh, Lordy Lou by Megatron. No, I think this is a great example of the strengths of different media. And it's a nice positive note to talk about in terms of the relationship between the book and the show, because that's obviously a contentious topic these days, even more so than before the ending of season 8. So, to get everyone together and sing Kumbaya, these are just two great scenes. Like the scene on the show is so like bone dry and brutally effective, and it's a great example of editing. In the same way that putting Bran 2 and Tyrion 4 together side by side is a great example of a very different kind of editing. There's what do you call it in comics? I think it's gutters, or how you refer to like the space in between panels, like the white space, and the space of implication, and plot events happen there, and things happen off screen, and character emotions happen. And George has always been very good in the gutters, always been very good at creating meaning out of putting two chapters together. It's something we've talked about before, and we'll talk about a lot going forward. And that's something you see in the show too, is the power of editing and the power of putting two images together. This goes back to the primary idea of the Kuleshov effect in filmmaking, the idea that editing is cinema, that putting two images together is what makes meaning more than any one image. And you see that in the 1, 2, 3 scene in the show so perfectly, just cutting in the same room from Tyrion's conversation, boom, 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 Pycelle, Littlefinger, Varys. And by necessity, what you lose is what makes this chapter special, which is the sprawl, the details, the endless lists. I've been now rereading the greatest novel of all time, Gravity's Rainbow. And one of the things that makes it so special are just the endless lists and endless details. And is super relevant for a book that's all about like the horrible, great invisible systems that control our lives. And so that's a lot of what George is getting at in The Song of Ice and Fire, too. So it's appropriate you have all those details, and you can get lost in them and bounce back and forth. But this is one case, I think, where the show wasn't correcting a mistake, but just cleaning it up into a perfect visual format. And I just think it's great.
Right. And, props to Catherine Chappelle, who was the editor for this scene from Game of Thrones Season 2. She actually passed away just a few years ago. But this is kind of a terrible thing to say, but she was killed in a lioness attack on safari in Africa. So, wow, just found that out by Googling that. Or I forgot about it recently. I think, the other thing too, I think makes the show a bit better is the way they've kind of framed it. Like it's a bit confusing. Like I had to read it a couple times to kind of refresh my mind, having read the books a couple times now and being a reputed Song of Ice and Fire expert, as everyone says, right. But at the same, in the show, it's very much cleaned up and very easy to understand. And I love some of the acting that's done too with Conleth Hill when they're like, when Tyrion's like, I plan to marry Myrcella to Theon Greyjoy, and Varys just like deadpans like, Theon Greyjoy.
And he just, really, my lord, that just makes no sense. I love Conleth Hill in that scene. He's just playing it. Every word is just beautiful.
Right. And then the other thing I love too is the way they use the pillar in the scene from the show. You can look us on YouTube where Tyrion walks across he walks across from left to right on the screen, saying something, and then he walks back across, and the shot of Tyrion, and then another shot immediately of the person who you weren't expecting to see because he was just interacting with Pycelle, with Varys, and then you show up and you turn around and there's Littlefinger there, and you're like, Littlefinger's like, and I'm not supposed to tell the queen what, and it's done really, really, really well. So we've got numerous criticisms of the Game of Thrones TV show. I think I appreciate the show more than anything for bringing me to A Song of Ice and Fire.
But of course,
but it's at least the first couple seasons they did mostly a really excellent job of adapting this work, and that's something that we kind of do need to praise the show is in terms of its adaptation powers, the way that it does the hard work of taking something that George had once described as impossible to translate to television, to a movie, and making it palatable and making it interesting for us as people to watch. And that's good. I think it's good on the show's part.
And one thing I think that really makes this scene great, and one thing you highlighted talking about just the pillar and the way it works, is that it's a scene that was clearly shot with the editing in mind. And that is something that I think defines a lot of great TVs and movies and differentiates them from a lot of, mediocre to bad TVs and movies. Is there's so many TV shows and big budget movies where it's clearly just like, shoot whatever material we have, we will cobble it together in editing. And you can do that if you're like, if your editor is like Thelma Schoonmaker, who shoots all of Scorsese's movies, and she's a genius. And if you're that good, or like the woman who edited Pulp Fiction, whose name escapes me at the moment, if you're that good at editing, you can cobble together a story out of that. But most people are not. Right. And so I think a lot of what makes an effective showrunner is you have the second level of your mind going, what's it going to look like in the editing suite? And that was clearly a shot with okay, Peter, you're going to turn right here when you say this line, because then we're going to edit it right here. And that was just like every wheel was turning, every element was in on this exact event that was going to happen. And that kind of snapping together and that precision is what made Game of Thrones at its best really great. And when even my favorite moments of the later seasons did feel more like, let's shoot everything and let's edit it together afterwards and see what we can come up with.
Yeah, they blocked the shit out of that scene when they did a fantastic job of doing that. And so props to Game of Thrones. Here's us praising the Thrones show after all these years down the road. I do remember that being those scenes with Tyrion and Varys and Littlefinger and Pycelle being among my favorites when I was watching season 2 before I even read the books. So props to the Thrones show. We have a lot of fun doing that. Yeah.
It's because, this is the kind of the scene you salivate to shoot if you want to make The Wire. Right. And not if you want to make Lord of the Rings. I think that's the crucial difference. And I think a lot of times the show felt a little more comfortable in the former domain. And I think a lot of people feel that way too when they read that. Tyrion's chapters are a kind of groove you get into. And a lot of the other rest of the series doesn't necessarily work like this, but this particular tone and structure really is just brilliant. And it's a pleasure to come back, and still a pleasure to watch those scenes from season 2.
Absolutely. So I think that about wraps us up for this analysis of A Clash of Kings Tyrion IV. For you guys that are there in the chat, we are going to stick around for a bit, chat with you guys, let our luxurious, I don't have long hair anymore. I'm losing my fucking hair. All hair down, and we're all going to chat, do some questions, discuss with you guys for maybe about an hour or so afterwards, and have a lot of fun that way. As always, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, SoundCloud, Podbean, everywhere and anywhere where you find our podcasts.
Check out our Patreon at patreon.com/NotAcastASOIAF, or follow us on Twitter at NotAcastASOIAF. Email us at NotAcastASOIAF@gmail.com. You can find me at PortQuentin on Twitter or at PortQuentin.com.
And you can find me at Brendan Beefish on Twitter, Brendan Beefish on Reddit, and my website is warsandpoliticsofIceandfire.wordpress.com.
We want to shout out and thank our high lords and ladies on Patreon: Lord of the Squishers and Warden of the Deep, Lord Clint Esquire, the Wolf in the West, Lady Veneris of the House Colgarian, the first of her name, the overworked Queen of the Pencils, the Eraser, and the First Draft, Queen of Monochrome, devotee of the Great Game of Thrones, portraitist of the Realm, Lady Realist of the Seven Kingdoms, creator of arts and maker of drawings, Lady of 1,000 Words, Septon Eastwood of Introvert Isle, Septon Maribald the Shoeless Sage, Lady Madeline Rivers, Justiciar of the Trident, Sister Winter, Lady of the Wolfswood, Nessie the Elusive, Warden of the Neck, Defender of the North, and Keeper of Secrets, Sandy the Dragon, Blood of Queen Daenerys, and Lady of Jameson, Lady Brit, Bastard Mistress of Harrenhal, Sir Thomas the Raven Knight, Lord of Blackwood, Sir Tim, the Knight who was guided by voices, Sir Courtenay, What did the Five Fingers say to the face Penrose, Lady Dillsdale, the Star Spear of Crescent Hill, Sir Way of Course, and our newest High Lord, Matt, Warden of the Sanguine Shore. So thank you very much to our High Lords and Ladies, and welcome, Warden Matt.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for your support, and again, welcome to Matt. And thank you, and keep the Sanguine Shore nice and warded. I don't know if that's a word or not. Doesn't matter.
Yeah, I called him Warden Matt. It's like, oh, that sounds like he's in charge of a prison. That's not great.
he's like a warden, like the.
I want to redo that.
Yeah, that's okay. We'll figure it out. This will be your mulligan. Remember, I had that mulligan with the cannoli Oli, Master of Cannoli, whatever that guy was.
Exactly.
Fall Council. Yeah. So join us next week as we stay right here in King's Landing for Clash of Kings Sansa 2, in which two drunk not knights take out their issues on Sansa. Oh, Emmett, are these men ever going to like grow up?
It's been great with both Dantos and Sandor. Sandor especially, where Sandor just says the thing where like he talks about his backstory for a few paragraphs, and Sansa goes, "Okay," so when Sandor goes, "I'm not done. Let me talk more about how my trauma kind of relates to your trauma, but I can't deal with it. Fuck me, I'm drunk." It's a short chapter, but a really depthful chapter and really great thematically for Sansa's story. And the way Dantos and Sandor bounce off each other and are similar and not is a really interesting topic to me.
It is a really interesting topic, and it's going to provide a lot of fertile ground for lots of future plot points in Clash and A Storm of Swords, and the Winds of Winter probably as well. So thank you guys so much for listening. Thank you guys for watching, those you're watching on our live cast. And again, for you guys who are watching, we are going to stick around. We already got some questions queued up. We're going to be answering those immediately now. And we will see you guys next week. All right. Stop the Audacity recording.
Yes, indeed.
All right.
Lovely.
That was a good episode, I thought. It
was. I think we're slightly biased.
Just slightly biased. Thank you guys so much for watching too. It's I think we were commenting not this time, but last time, how like when we first started out, I was like nervous as fuck when do these live casts, but you guys make it very easy for us, providing lots of laughs. And apparently a whole political debate between capitalism and socialism was occurring while we were doing our podcast. Is that what's happening?
We're being asked to talk about that. I'm not putting Jeff through that. He knows deep in his heart he's wrong. It's like the reverse of the Nixon sluggo. He's right. Jeff knows he's wrong. But yeah, we're already getting some heavy questions here. Broken King asks, oops, I just lost them. Back up. Broken King asks, I know it's a generic question, but what are the themes that George tries to push through Magic? Is it the danger of man playing God and having godly powers? That's definitely a huge part of it. I think for me, as I've said before, coming back to the series on reread, I feel more and more like it's about specifically how magical power intertwines with political structures that really causes the problem. Like Melisandre wouldn't be as dangerous without Stannis. Euron wouldn't be as dangerous if he didn't have a crown. Like it's the ways in which these two systems feed on each other that really start causing the problems. And, I just think about, like, if Euron just went and got high somewhere and sat on an island, he'd probably torture any animals that happened to pass him by. But you know what I mean? It's like it's the social structures combined with the magic that produces a lot of the terror. And I feel like George might be going for that.
I feel like also like magic reveals people as they are, like on the inside.
Sure, as with religion. Yeah.
Right. I mean, you can cheat to get ahead, as Stannis kind of does, allegedly, of course, with allegedly
defense attorney over here. The Rudy Giuliani of Stannis Baratheon.
I thought we were going to do real world politics. God damn it. Okay, so
true. Forgive me. Carry on.
No, it's all good. So I mean, it reveals how characters are, and I think that Martin uses that as a way to talk about that. And I think like we see that in the context of something like Stannis. We also see it in the context of something like Bran too, right? Who has the ability to skin change Hodor, and he's a little bit like I'm not gonna say that he's excused for his actions, but he is a bit young, right? So he's not totally fully cognizant of what he's doing, at least in A Storm of Swords. But by A Dance of Dragons, he kind of knows what he's doing, and that does provide some like difficult ethical issues for Bran to deal with, and it provides a bit of an arc for him in the Winds of Winter, where you think and hope that Bran is going to move beyond that, and move beyond utilizing people as his own vessel to occupy.
Completely agree. Yeah, I think that's a good comparison. Micah asks, what do you think of Tyrion's supporting cast and how do they complement him or not in the books? This is something we talked about recently in terms of our POVs. I'm kind of lukewarm. I mean, Tyrion's such kind of an overwhelming presence that he tends to blot out his supporting cast. As I said, I really enjoy his dynamic with Cersei. Obviously, his dynamic with Tywin is incredible and literary and well done. With the more minor characters, his dynamic with Jorah feels like a missed opportunity to me so far. It feels like we could have gotten more out of that in Dance, or at least to make Jorah a more depthful character than he is. Tyrion and Bronn, while the relationship on the show kind of had some snarky eye winky elements to it, I didn't always enjoy. I think is actually more depthful than the relationship in the books.
Yeah.
So a mixed bag, I would say. What do you think?
I think Bronn is mostly good. I think again Jorah's mostly bad. At least it's not bad. It's just underexplored. It feels underbaked, kind of, that George was rushing to the end and kind of forgot about what Jorah could possibly mean. Like, what is Jorah as a slave? What is that going to mean for this guy who was enslaving people in the north? Like, this could have been a really...
It's right there. All the material is there, but it doesn't seem like it's been actualized yet.
Right. Something I love to talk about and think about is Tyrion's relationship with Brown Ben Plum, which is just evolving at the end of A Dance with Dragons.
That's a good one, yeah.
And, we have this kind of sense of kind of a more advanced version of Bronn in the form of Brown Ben Plum, because he is much more adept at playing the Game of Thrones than Bronn is, at least when Tyrion last encounters him in A Storm of Swords. And, Tyrion makes the explicit connection to Brown Ben Plum with Bronn. There's some other characters I'm also curious to see what's going to happen in the Winds of Winter. Before I do that, I'll backtrack. The one side character I think is done really, really well that is completely underloved, and it sucks that the fandom has looked at this character as shitty, which means that they're shitty, is the character Penny, which I think is the most vital character for Tyrion to understand what it's like to be a person with disabilities outside of his social class, because Penny has lived a shitty life, and yet she is extraordinarily optimistic. She makes one attempt to kill Tyrion, but after that, she's really nice to this guy who essentially got unfairly, but really got her brother killed, Oppo killed by the people in, I don't remember what town was it, Bravos, or was it Volantis that he was killed in?
Volantis. Well, yeah. She tries to kill him, and then she's nice to him when he's nice, and then when he's a dick, she's responds in kind, and I think that's important. And yeah, Penny gets easily stereotyped as always complaining, when what it really is that Penny is always honest about what she's feeling, which Tyrion is not, and that's the point. And I think that it's part of the negative reaction to Penny. I feel like part of it is driven by people who enjoy Tyrion's armor and enjoy his like kind of emotional blocked off way in a way that I don't think the author necessarily intends. And so that's naturally they're going to reject Penny, a character designed to get Tyrion out of his shell and point out, hey, this is a choice ultimately, this way you're behaving. So I get the backlash to Penny, but I think she's a more complex and a better character than she's given credit for. But I also really worry Tyrion's going to kill her, and I'm not eagerly anticipating that plot point, to be honest.
No, but I think that's important for Tyrion to kill Penny for plot reasons, even though I'm not really looking forward to that, in the same way that the Red Wedding was important for plot reasons, even though I'm not looking forward to that chapter in A Storm of Swords. All right, next question from Koi V, who asked, were the Antler Men real or just people Varys wanted gone?
Maybe both.
Right? In Tyrion 2, we have this line where Tyrion makes this connection in his mind that he was replaced Janos Slint with Jocelyn Bywater. He's like, Varys is saying I just replaced one of Littlefinger's men with one of my own men, but the reality is I probably replaced him with one of Varys's men in terms of Jocelyn Bywater. Mm-hmm. Is this what's going on later in A Clash of Kings? Is Varys again doing the same thing where he's trying to like cut out some of these people that are loyal to Littlefinger? I don't know, but I do think it's interesting in Tyrion IV, and I think this is why this question was asked. You get this line about how Littlefinger replaced all of the noble classes who are occupying these roles of the Keeper of the Keys, the people who are in charge of import and export, the grain merchants, all these different characters with his own set of rogues, essentially. You have to, and this is my theory, not theory, it's half baked, but I do wonder whether those are some of the people that Varys wanted replace and finger them as being Stannis's men, maybe, possibly.
Yeah, I think that's where I come down to.
But I mean, at the same time, they could be, actual Stannis supporters. So they could be. That would be great.
Those occasionally exist. Some people shout his name during the riot, so it's definitely possible. Don't want to count that out entirely. What do we got? We got Maddie asking, how do you feel about Cersei's supporting cast in the Feast? Individually, I don't think any of them are particularly interesting. I think the collective is the point. I'm sorry. This crew of reprobates and useless cast-offs. I think the fact that Cersei thinks this is a good idea That's hysterical. And I love their scenes. I love like when none of them can remember who Theon's name is. That's fun. But like, I don't care about Orton Merryweather as a character.
Well, I mean, I've had this essay on the back burner for a long time that Orton Merryweather is one of Varys' spies, possibly, maybe agents in the same way because Lady Merryweather.
That is their allegiance is an interesting question. True.
That's interesting to me, but I don't want to totally disagree with you. But Rain Waters is super fucking interesting in small council scenes just because of how, and this a lot of it comes from how Cersei is projecting Rhaegar onto
That
Rain.
Is interesting. Yep, true.
And then like she makes a later determination that no, he's not. He doesn't actually look like Rhaegar all that often. But hey, I'm going to give him more ships and more men and more people to like carry out my totally brilliant scheme that I have going on in terms of rebuilding the royal fleet, and having them crewed by criminals. I mean, that's one of the funniest things in a Feast for Crows. Like there's in the same way the Victorians, as you've commented in the past, Victorians chapters are very much they're comedy. The jokes on Victorian. But Cersei's Feast for Crows chapters are very much comedy, but they're a joke on Cersei Lannister primarily.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great point. And it's Maxwell brought up Qyburn, and Qyburn is the other fun one, of course. I love Cersei's relationship with Qyburn, where she's oddly charmed by him, which of course Qyburn would be the one Cersei finds charming. And that is always an enjoyable relationship on the show as well.
Yes, agreed there. Let's see here. There's a question that
go ahead.
No, after you.
MM asks, who has the best consecutive set of chapters in any of the books? Brienne and Feast, Davos and Storm. I think this is one we've talked about before. Those are both great choices. Brienne's chapters in the second half of Feast are amazing. Broken Man, Quiet Isle, No Chance, No Choice. Davos and Storm, his Dragonstone chapters, his Hand for Stannis are some of the most dense, incredible material in the series. Obviously, I'm biased towards Quentin's chapters in Dance. I think those are a great run. Theon's chapters in Winterfell and Dance. Those 4 close-knit chapters of Paranoia and Doom are wonderful. In Clash, the one we're dealing with currently, my favorite run in a single POV might be the last few Jon chapters. Those Frostfang chapters, Jon 6, 7, and 8, those are so cool. Yeah. Just like the great imagery and the action of it all. Yeah, as Stephen Abel was, I think, written about, like, put on the soundtrack from The Last Mohicans when you're going through Jon's run through the mountains. It's so good. But I mean, for me, like, John Connington's 2 chapters. I mean, he's only got 2, but they're pretty much perfect chapters in my mind, of course. Sure. I have to let my biases. Yeah, let my freak flag fly. Quentin's are great as well. I'm trying to think of like just like the opposite. Like, is there like a set of chapters like back to back that you're like, I'm not a huge fan of? Within a POV? Within a POV, yeah. Where you're just like, I mean, Arya's first 2 chapters in Storm are a little for me. Like, just get to Beric Dondarrion already. Like, I get it. It's Robin Hood, but it's darker. I get it. I don't care. I try, but the Brotherhood are great, but Beric and Thoros for me just kind of blot them out in terms of interest. So that's a little kind of tiresome for me. Yeah, agreed there. I'll just do this one. Julie asks, old news, but I love that George answered Jeff's question about Robert's Rebellion. Yes, that was a lot of fun to get that answer. And George also said in that interview, he's like, well, I think we could be expecting the Winds of Winter sort of soon. I'm hoping so, at least. So isn't that nice? And they're like, oh, okay. On the 43rd of March-tember, I shall descend from Mount Olympus. Yes, hey, we'll see when we see it, George. Way to appropriate my Twitter presence, dude. Way to appropriate it. It's not that hard, Jeff. What else we got here? I think there's something farther up. Let me pull one from. Sure. Okay, Aaron M. asks, expanding on Game of Thrones, the show, were there any adaptation decisions in the first 4 seasons that you didn't like? For instance, I didn't like the addition of Talisa. Yep. Yeah. Can't argue with that. The whole Craster's Keep detour in season 4 is baffling to me still. Like, I don't understand what the point of the Luck character was. Like, you see, that seems like one of those subplots where you just like you write in sequential order and you get to the end and you would just hope the audience isn't thinking about what happened in the previous parts of the season because none of it pays off or makes sense. And there's quite a few of those, storylines going on later in the show. Yeah, but that cropped up early on. And I really like Pedro Pascal as Oberyn. Some of the whole he lives in a brothel stuff was a little much. Yeah, I mean, my thesis about Game of Thrones is that season 4 is actually where the downturn of the show occurred. It's a little bit controversial, but it's correct. A lot of stuff comes down to how they frame things. I think
the way that Tyrion specifically was framed as being, the guy who was defending his life from Shay, not the person who actually like out and out murdered her after she confessed to. She said she called Tyrion her giant of Lannister one final time, and that's what leads him to strangling her to death. That stuff to kind of like lighten up some of the aspects of Tyrion. It is a bit of a pattern, and it's a bad pattern, I think, because George is doing the job here in Tyrion IV and in all of Tyrion's Clash chapters of showing us that Tyrion is kind of not a good guy. And that takes us to our next question from Pat D, one of our High Lords, who asks, do you guys think Tyrion is a good guy? Through everything, is he trying his best or just using people for his own end?
I don't know, man. The older I get, the more I'm like, is this person good or bad? Starts to become, except in the most extreme, obvious cases, like Septon Maribald, good guy. Euron Greyjoy, bad guy. It starts to become less relevant and starts to become, well, what are their actions? Maybe there isn't a person deep down at the core, nestled in there like a beautiful little kernel fetus of our true selves waiting to emerge one day. Maybe we are what we do. And on that count, it's really hard to stick up for Tyrion Lannister for me as in any way other than the best of a bad lot. You know what I mean? Yeah. I can defend him on that count. Best of a bad environment, and that's pretty much it.
Yeah, that's my perspective as well. I think it's a separate question from, is there going to be ultimately redemption for what Tyrion does in the story? I don't know. I feel like that the show hinted at this idea of I think the show tried to hint at this idea that Tyrion would be paying back all of the bad things he did by serving as hand of the king. But then when you look at
which I kind of get in theory because he doesn't want to do it, but that's still like he's sitting on a nice chair in a nice room and he's getting his meals.
Right.
So how much of a punishment is this really?
And remember, this is the same guy, and as we quote in the episode itself, it's like, I love this. God's help me, but I do love this. Yeah.
So that's, I think, again, that's the kind of thing where like you can imagine some internal monologue paragraphs working that out. You can imagine a spookier, more in charge of things Bran having more things to say on this subject. I can imagine a version of this if it works, but I can understand people knee-jerk reacted to it with, oh, that's Tyrion's punishment, is it? Because that does kind of ring kind of false. So yeah, I don't know. I really hope his murder of Shay, and if he does murder Penny, his murder of Penny, I really hope that's important. I don't demand it lead to any particular outcome where that Tyrion must suffer the exact same fate as his victims. Otherwise, he's a character that doesn't work. I think that's silly. But that has to matter. Like, otherwise, I think at the end of the day, it's a poorly written character arc. So I do hope it matters more than it did in the show.
I absolutely agree there. All right. Our King's Justice, Sir Frank B, asks, if you could ask George a question centered on Clash, what would it be?
I mean, the obvious one for me is what's the deal with Euron? Like, how much of this Euron setup here is conscious of where you're going with the character, the little bits that we get. Other than that, I don't know. What do you think?
I kind of would. I like the question that I forget your name. Sorry, man. Starts with a C. So asked earlier, like, what were the Antler Men in the story? What are they? Are they actually people that were loyal to Stannis? Or are they, is Varys attempting to steer the realm more towards his direction as opposed to Littlefinger's? I think when you look at questions to ask George, and this is, if you guys ever get the opportunity to ask George a question, it's probably better. You'll probably get a better answer if you ask about something that doesn't pertain to something major for the future for the Winds of Winter, because George is going to say,
don't ask a useful question. Don't ask a question you might want the answer to, because he will not answer it. So you have to cut in very obliquely.
Right. That's why I asked the question. Like, instead of like, when is the Winds of Winter coming out? You asked the question, what side would you take during Robert's Rebellion? And thankfully, George answered the question, which was really cool. I was pleased as peach, as you might say. So yeah, I think a question about the Antlermen would be something that George might answer, because what purpose does it have for the future of the plot? Like, I can't imagine that it's going to have a major impact on the Winds of Winter or Dream of Spring, that, because the Antlermen have been replaced, we've got this plot event happening in the Winds of Winter. But I don't know. I'm sorry, Coy. I know it's you. Now I see that it's you, Coy. I apologize. Please forgive me.
What else? We got any others recently? I'm trying to look up the chat here.
Is Euron? Oh, there's one for you. Maxwell asks, is Euron the Grey Lips dude in Dany's vision? That's what he'd ask. So I'm asking you if Euron's the Grey Lips guy from the house.
As in the guy who's like nailed to the prow of the ship? In the House of the Undying, or are we talking about the blue lips guy she dreams of? There's so many dreams with lips. The blue lips guy Danny dreams of in Dance with Dragons. I assume gray lips. You're talking about the House of the Undying vision.
Smiling sadly, yeah, great, yeah.
Gray lips smiling sadly. Yeah, that seems to be referring to some kind of Greyjoy, but you could also make the case that's referring to Victarion. Or to Euron with Aeron on the brow, given the Forsaken. That image in particular is one of the ones House of the Undying that makes me look askance and wonder exactly how much might have changed in the planning there, because that even more than the rest, that seems to refer to several things at once and none of them satisfyingly. So we'll see.
There's a bunch of stuff like that. There's also the what's the other thing about the stone dragons coming to life sort of thing?
Oh, sure, that one I think might be Euron, just because the only other options I've heard for it are that it's referring to Melisandre,
right,
or to John Connington, which is weird because the other two visions in that section are also about Stannis and Roof. Our House of the Undying episode is going to be a lot of fun and also very boring, folks, because it's going to be a lot of this.
It might be a couple parts. We'll find out, as we did for Davos and then for the.
There's no structure for that chapter. The entire thing is foreshadowing and groundwork. It's going to be very hard to build the chapter around. It's one of my favorite chapters in the series, but it is a monster.
Mm-hmm. All right, Broken King asks, how would a Robb a Clash of Kings point of view look like? That's what he would ask him. So we're just answering questions that people are going to ask George. That's a good question. I think I would be curious if we'd have how George would obscure plot points, in Tyrion's chapters, the chain. We don't know what it's being used for, and Tyrion and George has Tyrion never thinking about what he's going to use the chain for until we get to Davos's third chapter in the Clash of Kings. Mm-hmm. Would we have Robb doing the same thing when he's talking with Catelyn about what he's planning on doing about marching on Harrenhal or going towards the Golden Tooth? That would be something I would find interesting as a potential narrative choice that George might make. What about you?
I really like George's structure of not having the people with crowns be POVs other than Daenerys. Mm-hmm. A very critical exception because she's kind of isolated from everybody else. I think that's a very smart move. I think that makes Stannis and the Mance more interesting characters than they might otherwise be if we had full access to their thoughts. And I think Robb, while I love the boy, is not necessarily the most interesting character if you remove him from Catelyn's perspective. Mm-hmm. So I think to make that work, I think you'd have to have another person as the POV on him. Maybe someone like Daisy Mormont could be interesting because the Mormonts are a prominent family, but we don't have a POV in them. And I would like to see Robb's Western campaign, just to see it and see the strategies unfold, get more details about the Westerlands, because we haven't actually been in the Westerlands over the course of A Song of Ice and Fire. And as I've said before, I think it would help George's arguments about even the good kings are doing as bad stuff as the bad kings that you see him making over the course of Clash and Storm. That argument would be strengthened if we saw Robb's army in the Westerlands, inflicting atrocities, not in the way that Tywin is, the mass deliberate way, but casually, the way soldiers, but the way soldiers end up doing in any war. That's happening with Robb's men. I think it would strengthen George's overall thematic argument if we got to see it. And I guess it doesn't really matter who the POV would be for that.
I agree, and I think George attempts to do that in having when Catelyn returns to River Run, being Robb is repaying the Lannisters with their own coin and stealing the crops and then cows out of the lands in the Westerlands. But it's not made as poignant, and we do get some of that in Jaime's perspective. Where was that in Jaime's second or third chapter where they encounter the hanged women they lay with lions? Yeah,
that first they lay with lions. We do get that. That's really chilling and effective. And I think you can see George almost self-correcting at that point, going, "Oh right, I got to make sure people understand that Robb's side is also doing this stuff."
Absolutely.
We got one from a Guilty Undertaker. If Euron is tripping balls on Shade of the Evening all the time, how is he able to function? Well, let's take it away. Hard right turn to psychedelic drugs, folks. I mean, Shade of the Evening it's not exactly a direct proxy for any one drug. The imagery is pure DMT. The kind of spacey, trippy tone to it that Dany experiences in the House of the Undying, where she looks at things and just goes, "Huh, that's interesting." That's much more LSD. And then there's also stuff like Soma. That we have drunken Soma and attained godhood. That whole crumbling fragment. That's all we have about it. So you can't really necessarily relate it to any one real world experience, but speaking from personal experience and from the people I've known, you can, if you have a certain kind of intellect and attitude, you can walk around all damn day on drugs and people will just think it's your personality. If you saw Jared Leto on 20 hits of acid, would you know? Could you tell? Isn't that just kind of how he is all the time? And that's Euron. It's just his personality. like lounging around making pronouncements about how all gods have brought nothing and he is the one true life force of the mana universe. Like, that seems like Euron was already always this way, and Shade of the Evening just made him this way. I think if Victarion had actually swallowed that Shade of the Evening Euron offered him, he would be catatonic. He would not be moving because Victarion's personality and temperament is just not inclined toward that. Euron is the kind of guy who is very happy. It's the same way. I mean, John Lennon didn't exactly get away scot-free with the amount of acid he took, but he was able to walk around and function because that's just kind of his personality anyway.
Yeah. So what you're saying is like is drugs in the same way that magic and religion does works to.
It's a normalizing procedure. Yeah. For Melisandre, like the fire entering her and her bleeding and having visions, it's normal now. That's a day in Melisandre's life.
Right.
And for Euron, like, he's just permanently in the House of the Undying. He's just permanently stoned. I remember, like, was it Seth Rogen went on some show, the OSS. It's like, so, how often are you high? And Seth Rogen went like, well, I'm never like not. I'm never completely not. There's always something in there. And that's Euron. This is just permanent. He's not partying. This is just constant.
Mm-hmm.
Now that we've made Jeff horribly uncomfortable, let's move on to a less countercultural question.
Our Warden of the West. There we go. Sorry, I'm always trying to think of their actual names on the Small Council. Asks Leathers. Do you guys remember him? And what do you think of him?
Right, that guy. I like him. He's I wish he had more scenes because politically he's really interesting. This wildling who joins up with Jon and becomes a master at arms. Like, that's a prominent position, training people and like, get wildling techniques. I hope we get like an intimate moment with him. I like the one we get where like we learn he just like drinks with one for fun. I just like imagine them getting drunk around the fire together. But I like him. I like him very much.
Yeah, I like him too. I don't really have any major thoughts about him. I think he's fun. I mean, I think he's an interesting thing that maybe George will explore a little bit more come the Winds of Winter, because he's not among the Night's Watchmen that kills Jon, so he'll likely take a pro Jon position, maybe preserve his body sort of thing, move him to the ice cells, maybe.
That's always the thing people talk about is logistics of Jon's body. We've touched on that before, given that it happens in public and daytime, unlike the show, and characters like Leathers or Satin, they're the useful ones. Again, George knows when you need pallbearers, when you need an entourage, you need to have those tertiary characters ready to go, established, and that's what these guys are.
Yeah, and for you guys who are interested in learning more about Leathers, our friends at the Girls Gone Canon podcast are smack dab in the middle of Jon's A Dance with Dragons chapter, so be sure to check them out.
They just covered recently Jon V, in which I think Leathers is introduced, or at least brought it more prominently when he becomes one of the wildlings to join the Night's Watch. So yes, the Girls Gone Canon are doing a great job of covering those political Jon materials, which have a lot in common with these Tyrion chapters, actually. That would be an interesting subject to talk about at length more, the commonalities between Tyrion's class chapters and Jon's dance chapters.
All right, we got Broken King who asks, since Sir Bonifer Hasty had romantic feelings for, quotation marks, Fagon's mother, could he declare for him and hand him Harrenhal? So, I don't know if that's going to be the case. I think it's more likely that he'll hand Harrenhal to Aegon, if that's even going to be a plot point, because of his strong affection for the Faith of the Seven. He's the Holy 100 or the Holy 86.
The Holy 86, as Jamie says, the ones that are left.
Right. I think that's more likely is what's going to happen, as opposed to like having this major payoff for this major character. Of course, it's more likely being like, yeah, I mean, the High Sparrow supports Aegon, so I support Aegon because I'm a good godly man, ensconced in my beliefs in the Faith of the Seven. But it could be, I guess.
Sure. I think you're referring to his to Fagon's quote unquote grandmother there.
Right, Rhaella. Yep.
That's who Bonifer Hasty had feelings for, and that. I'm always a little confused by how that plot's going to end up, because he's clearly established there, but no one who has Harrenhal ends well, but he's also not in the way of any particular army or anything. So I could see him joining with young Griffin, maybe burning for his troubles when Dany shows up. That seems about as likely as anything else.
Poor Sir Bonifer Hasty.
I don't know if I'm that sympathetic for him. He talks some mean stuff about poor Pia, makes me want to throw him off a bridge. But yeah, I mean, he's a better dude than the previous people who've owned Harrenhal. I'll definitely give him that.
All right, Guilty Undertaker asks, how much information do you think Varys later fed to Tywin and Cersei?
Well, we see him feeding him like a lot of bullshit and then a little gold dust. Like, he does the clever thing of like he has true reports about Dany, but he slips them in with a bunch of rumors and nonsense. So he's technically passing on the information, but not in such a way that they'll act on it. But I am curious when Tywin comes, because we don't really, when Tywin comes to King's Landing, our POVs are Tyrion, who is passing out in a field hospital, and Sansa, and no one tells anything to Sansa. So we don't really see what Tywin says to Varys and Littlefinger. And well, Littlefinger he already had in tow, but Varys and Pycelle when he first shows up. So I'm curious to see what that balance must have been like and how much Varys was feeding Tywin during his brief stay atop the power structure in King's Landing.
Guilty Undertaker says he probably told Tywin about Shay.
Yeah,
I think
that
that's
is
likely.
a good point. That is the one, I think, probably clear connection. I don't agree with the theories that Tywin had nothing to do with Shay and Varys just planted her there, because it's too deep in Tywin's psychology, as we've talked about before, as recently as Tyrion IV. This sexuality fixation common between the two men. I think it's definitely deliberately Tywin's choice, but Varys was also stage managing that scene. Agreed.
Just Reds, one of our small council patron, asks, "Oh boy, do you think John Connington will abandon Fagon if or when he finds out about Rhaegar's real son?" Okay, so I don't think that John Connington will find out about the other Jon Snow, but I do think that it's likely he'll find out that Fagon is Fagon, right? Fake Aegon. I think that's more likely what's going to happen, because that has to have a payoff, right? The amount of narrative space that occupies John Connington's 2 chapters is referring to how he's going to avenge Rhaegar's memory, and he wants to do this. He's going to become Tywin Lannister because that's the only way we could have won the battle at the Battle of the Bells, and it's the only way we're going to win in Westeros this time around. And like, I think the comeuppance for him is going to be somewhat similar to Tywin Lannister in that ultimately it's going to be for ruin. He's going to do all these horrible atrocities and war crimes for a guy who's not even his beloved's son, and that's going to be sad, and I think it's going to horrify John Connington at some level, and I don't know the type of action he'll take as a result.
Yeah, I agree that I don't think there's much time or space for the John plot to intersect with the young Griff plot directly. I think they're just more supposed to be echoes of each other, as we talked with our friend Grant on that one Patreon episode we did. And yeah, I think John Connington's character, I could argue it either way. I could see the tragedy in him never figuring it out, but I feel like there has to be a catharsis there, probably right before he dies or as he dies, that he'll learn the truth. But, if you look at the characters around young Griff as in varying stages of doom, like, oh, maybe Varys will make it have to serve Dany for a little bit. We'll see how long Arianne lasts. John Connington is the most doomed. So it's just a question of what scraps of information he gets on his way down the abyss.
Same question. Who does Varys end up with? Jon, Fagon, or Dany?
I mean, Varys.
From Tony 3483.
Part of me feels like Varys is another case like Cersei, where they were in love with the performer and they extended him long beyond his sell-by date. Because I get that Varys is, is a shapeshifter and is good at politics, but the way he's framed in Dance is like it was young Griff all along. I am all in on young Griff. He is my project. And I just find it so hard with the passion he feels wrapped up in that, the way he delivered that speech to Kevon, that even at a cold-blooded level, he's going to jump ship. Part of me feels like, no, this is the one thing that Varys sticks to and goes down with immediately. So a part of me feels like Dany does kill Varys in that she wipes out all of Team Aegon, and that they just made it a more kind of focused, intimate thing because of the performance and how those characters had evolved on the show without young Griff being there. What do you think?
I'm with you. I think ultimately it's all about young Griff for Varys. And, I believe for several years now that Varys doesn't simply have a connection to this kid of him being the best ruler who could possibly ever rule Westeros, the noblest boy who's ever lived, as he says in the Dance of Dragons epilogue. No, I think he's very much connected to him in family ties, blood ties, possibly. There's the great theory, which I'm a subscriber of the idea that Varys is connected with Illyrio's second wife. Oh God, what's her name? Not
Sarah.
Sarah. Yeah, Sarah Sorella. Sorella's the archetype from the Fire and Blood story. I think that's a possibility, and I think that connects Varys a little bit. Yeah, but I do ultimately think he goes down with the Varys, with the young Griff ship, literally, possibly literally, and gets burned by Dany. I do agree. Like that's one of the things. Like when we talk about criticism of the show, Varys kind of comes up strong in my mind because they really didn't have any place for him to go without young Griff. Like none of his plotting makes sense before. Like it seems like maybe at some level they were going to go for young Griff at the start, and they're like, "Oh no, we're not actually going to do that. We don't have enough page space or rather enough screen time to do all those plots." So
yeah,
they like
the way Illyrio drops out completely makes me think you're right about that.
Right, they literally just say like he used to be. This is a man owned by a friend of mine, but he's gone, and he's gone. So yeah, I think he's definitely going to die with young Griff in King's Landing. All right. So Eric R. asked, if you had to guess what happened to Tysha post the sexual assault, and do you think we'll ever get a hint of her future in the books?
I know George has commented somewhat obliquely in this regard, right? Like you said, that Tyrion is going to figure out wherever do whores go or whatever. Part of me just wants Taisha to just escape this plot because there's nothing good
Yes.
that's going to happen as a result of that. And it also just feels. I would believe that Tyrion's going to run into Taisha if not for the fact that Penny exists.
Yeah.
Because I feel like a lot of the character work you'd be getting out of for Tyrion in such a situation is kind of already there with Penny. Obviously, it's not the same relationship, but in terms of like, here is a person designed to kind of shock you out of your system, Tyrion, and get you just out of your own asshole all the time and force you to think about the world again. So part of me feels like that task is already, we already have a character assigned to that task. What do you think?
Agreed. I don't want Taisha to show back up in Tyrion's story. Tyrion is a very broken man by even a Clash of Kings, by a Game of Thrones, where he's mentioning Taisha and their backstory, and he's broken as a result of what happened to her and what he did to her. I think there's also an element to where you do want some good to come from people that like they've suffered enough. Why throw them back into Tyrion's storyline? George did say we will find wherever whores go, and I think that's I hope that's more metaphorical, like that.
I hope that's him referring to like Tyrion will find out, how the other half lives. Maybe that's his kind of way of getting at that. That's kind of what I took away from it. I hope.
Yeah, I hope so too. Charles EAS, what POVs do you think will die in the Winds of Winter?
That's a fun one. Well, Jon Con, we just mentioned. I think he's definitely on the list. Victarion, probably early on. Aeron, also early on, both as kind of fuel for Euron's fire. The other, young Griff adjacent POVs, so Orion might go. Assume if the young Griff plot gets resolved in TWOW, then Orion. If not, maybe she lasts the Dream of Spring. Ario Hoda, probably.
Yeah,
we'll go along with Doran Martell, and then I guess Cersei and Jaime are the big question marks. Then after that, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, this comes back to a question of how much of what we saw in. Well, this comes back to a question of how we can fit kind of a square peg into a round hole. Namely,
precisely,
how can we fit like the storyline that we saw in seasons 6, 7, and 8, and kind of engineer this back, reverse engineer it into like what's going to happen in A Song of Ice and Fire? And that's an interesting question. Is the end game going to be that Daenerys burns King's Landing at the end of A Dream of Spring, with young Griff in charge of King's Landing? Is that what's going to happen? As Em and I have both kind of reluctantly come to the perspective that maybe that's where George is going with the plot line that we have. Young Griff maybe lasting to A Dream of Spring. I don't know. I do agree with you with all your selections there of all the people who are going to, all the POVs are going to die. George has said specifically that POVs will be dying in the Winds of Winter, so take your bets. Yeah, I don't know. Hard to know.
True. Aaron M said Barristan 2 probably, and I think that's likely, regardless of honestly which theory about Barristan's future you believe in. But yeah, that's probably a good call as well.
Yep.
All right, we'll take a couple more.
Just Reds asked, do you think Jon will find out about his Targaryen blood if or when he becomes king of the North via Robb's will, with Mage and Galbert going to Howland?
Ain't that an interesting question? Presumably Mage and Galbert, who know that Robb named Jon his heir. They were supposed to be with Howland Reed. Robb was supposed to lead an attack on Victarion, but then the Red Wedding happened. So when they pop back up, it's a question of is Howland going to spill the other thing he knows, the other crown that Jon is heir to? I doubt that'll happen at the same time. I feel like Howland might confer privately or might send word privately, and that Jon has to deal with it, because I think Jon as Robb's heir is going to be dealt with at a more public level than Jon as Rhaegar's heir ever will be. You know what I mean? I think that's probably going to be limited to a handful of core characters. So I think those will both come up. I just think in slightly different contexts.
Yeah, I think when we're looking at how the story goes in season 7 and 8, which I think is kind of along the right track, I think that Jon has to bone Dany first before finding out that she's his aunt, because that leads to the maximum amount of narrative drama and struggle. Yeah, right.
You said narrative trauma and struggle, and I say cringe. Yeah, we're both right.
Yeah, it's basically how you write novels, right? You make it the hardest possible
quotient. Exactly.
Charles EA asks, do you think Jon will remain a POV when he comes back? Yes.
Yeah, George ain't missing the opportunity to explore all that fear and heartache and confusion. Plus, he has to learn about R+L=J, and there's just too much that he has to do and deal with that can't be told through Melisandre's eyes, especially since she has her own stuff to do.
Micah asked, do you think the others might get south of Winterfell? I hope they do, so the other lords in the south can see the truth rep besides Euron in the Reach. I kind of think it's a better story if they don't know. If the deeds of all of the Northmen and the Vale Knights that they're going to be there goes completely unnoticed by the Knights and Lords of the South. I mean, it makes kind of for a really bitter sense of a bittersweet ending, but I think that's maybe what George might go for. That we have, and we do see it in the form of the Night's Watch, right? No one besides the Northmen know, and Tywin Lannister at some level knows that Mance Rayder is coming down on the wall, and yet they defend the realm, and with the help of Stannis, of course, helping to come in there too. I think it makes for a more interesting storyline if the South doesn't know what's happened in the North. I'm
divided on that. I get the argument you're going for there. Certainly, it does fit with that bittersweet idea, and definitely fits with the idea of the Night's Watch. But man, if is the South not even plunged into darkness at this point? Because what was the historical Long Night even about? That's all that happens here. And Dany has that dream about an army in ice at the Trident, so it's possible they get that far. I do think a lot of this, as implied in the question, this is in large part why Euron exists at all. Is to bring this kind of apocalyptic tone and fury to the South. But it's just at some point, like the other lords have to realize what's happening, right? Even if they don't do anything about it. Like, I have a hard time believing that this is just going to fade away into history and legend and myth. It's a giant army of zombies. It's so publicly there. In the long term, I understand another 8,000 years it's going to fade. But in the immediate aftermath, it's going to be very, especially with Bran as king, it's going to be difficult for me to accept much hand waving about the South being like, oh, whatever, other invasion. I really hope it's not like that.
Yeah, I understand your perspective. Yeah, I get it. All right, Raggedy. He's one of our small council members. Ragged Michael, Word of the North, and excuse me, asks the Mad Mouse, what's his deal? Just a threat for Brienne and Sansa to deal with? Question mark. Take it away while I cough my lungs out.
But of course, yeah, Sir Shadrick, the Mad Mouse. I like him. He gets fun dialogue. There's no way he succeeds at getting Sansa to Varys and King's Landing. So I think, and many people have suggested this, I think what he might be there to do is to just, in his attempt to do so, he might expose Sansa's identity. Like, that's how people find out that it's not a laid in stone. Although, as the ladies at Girls Gone Canon have pointed out, a lot of them probably already know. In the same way, probably a lot of the Northern Lords know that that's not Arya Stark married to Ramsay. The people pick up on these things. But I think Sir Shadrick attempts to steal Sansa as Sansa Stark might be what exposes her identity to the gathered lords of the Vale.
Well, maybe it's just like the pretense that the Vale Lords be like to know, like to reveal that they're like, oh my God, it's Sansa Stark as revealed by Sir Shadrick the Mouse, who stole her away, and now she's revealed herself as Sansa, and we can all back her. Now let's all go north and fuck shit up in Winterfell. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, I think that's about right. It's a little plot beat along the way, just a little spark.
All right, we'll take two more questions. Is that fine with you?
Sure, works for me, buddy.
All right, Guilty Undertaker asks, how quote-unquote official do you think Rhaegar and Lyanna's wedding will be in the books? I find the High Septon annulled it and didn't let anyone know. Hard to believe.
Yeah, that detail, I could see it in the books being more like they murdered him or something, something a little darker. But I mean, there is just a great poetry in Jon not being ambassador at all, actually, ever. That does make sense to me. And the Isle of Faces is this holy place. So I think there was definitely some kind of official ceremony, although I think it might be kind of interfaith in a way. It might have involved both the faith of the Seven and the Old Gods. So it was probably unorthodox. Maybe it was someone like Septon Marable. Maybe it was Septon Marable. I know that's a theory that's been thrown around before. Yeah,
it could be. Yeah, well, that'd be actually really cool if it was Marable just revealed as the person who did the marriage portion of it. I mean, there's also the possibility too that we have the Tyrion archetype where he marries Tysha, he gets married by Septon, but it's kept kind of seriously under wraps, and Tywin forces the Septon to undo the marriage, and we never hear about the Septon ever again. So you don't know whatever happened to him, and probably never will happen to him because he's kind of tertiary. So I think it could be the case. I do think the High Septon annulled it and didn't let anyone know is a bit hard to believe, given that it's the High Septon of Westeros who would do this sort of thing. But you also have to factor in stuff like the chaos of King's Landing at the time.
True.
You've got Robert's Rebellion occurring. You've got Aerys going crazier and crazier. You've got again, Tywin coming down and sacking the city. Was maybe the High Septon murdered by Tywin? I don't know. I don't even know who the High Septon was during that time.
That's a great point. Yeah. There's such chaos and flux. And again, this is one of those situations where George has planted his seeds vaguely to his benefit. So he can come up with pretty much any vaguely plausible scenario he wants here because he hasn't filled this out already.
Absolutely. Okay. Final question from Jake A. He asks, what will happen to the remaining Freys after the twins totally come down?
Well, people know my love for young Big Walder Frey, and crucially, he's not anywhere near the twins at the moment. so he might not be around when a lot of the Riverland stuff goes down. I think Lane Lothar also has been built up fairly strongly, so I do think he emerges as the sad little king of the sad little hill after all this stuff, after the Stoneheart wave of vengeance has worked itself out. And I like to think of Big Walter coming home and taking over, but I don't know what situation the twins will be in. And maybe I could see a situation which they're like broken down and their lands are in disrupt and they need help getting even back on their feet and they have to reform in order to do it. I could see that kind of thing working out.
I agree with that. I think we talked about it in our episode on Brand 1 about this idea that Big Walter will work his way into Stannis' good graces, and then when Stannis falls, maybe he worms his way back into Jon Snow's good graces as King in the North. Maybe then after that is all done, he ends up working his way into Bran's good graces again, being like, "Hey, remember me? We were such good friends back in Winterfell, back in Clash of Kings. Can you?"
And Bran goes like, "Sure, we will. It's fine. I'll let you live." Because that's the other thing. Big Walter kind of has this in common with Littlefinger in that no one really likes him, but it's not in anyone's interest to deal with him, and that's his advantage.
Yeah, agreed there. So I think that ultimately wraps us up. We appreciate you guys sticking around for this post-episode Q&A. We really we have a lot of fun doing these things, and yeah, it's a lot of fun. Obviously, we'll be back next month with another live cast episode, and of course, if you guys want to listen to this episode again, it will be available in your regular podcast formats, both on Patreon and on our regular streams and stuff like that. As Emmett was saying, please smash the motherfucking like button on your way out and hit the alert button too, that kind of bell thing that will alert you every single time we're actually going to be doing a live cast episode itself. That'll be a lot of fun. And if you guys are able to, we do have our next Patreon only episode coming out next week about the Greyjoy Rebellion, which is going to be a lot of fun. If you guys are not patrons, you're welcome to check us out at patreon.com/NotAcastASOIF, and we'll do all sorts of fun and lovely things for you guys on Patreon and elsewhere in the months and years to come.
Yes, indeed. We got the Greyjoy Rebellion coming up and a bunch of great chapters coming up soon in the Clash of Kings. So only sunshiny horizons as we head into the horrible winter, appropriately enough.
Oh, that was so much fun. That's a great way to close on a depressing, sad note.
I try.
Thanks for listening and watching. We'll see you guys soon.